Welcome to Eternal Christendom, consecrated to Our Lady for the glory of our Lord. I'm Joshua Charles. So I'm very excited for today's interview with my friend John Davidson. He is a convert to the Catholic faith from Protestantism. And we are going to be talking about not only his conversion, but pretty hot button topic, namely the state of Israel and Zionism, particularly from a theological lens. I think many of you will find his thoughts very provocative and hopefully very clarifying. We had a very honest discussion, and I'm looking forward to seeing the reactions to it. Before we get into it, a little bit of biography on John. He is the senior editor at the Federalist, and his writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Claremont Review of Books, the New York Post, and elsewhere. He's also the author of Pagan America, The Decline of Christianity and the Dark Age to Come. You can follow him on X, formerly Twitter, at John Davidson. I highly, highly recommend it. He's an insightful guy. He's a man who lives what he preaches, and preaches what he lives in many ways. So which we actually need more of that, actually. People lining up their lives is what they talk about. So John is a premier example of that. And as a fellow convert, I know he knows well the pain of conversion, but also the joy and the enthusiasm of conversion. I think you'll see plenty of that on display in this interview. So without further ado, my friend, John Davidson. All right, welcome to my friend John Davidson. It has been quite an epic journey to finally have this interview. I was sick once. I think you were sick once. I had some car issues once. I had a tech issue once. We had more tech issues before trying to do this interview. We were originally, I think, going to be interviewing you during Lent.
Yeah.
But then the war with Iran started, and you're in the political commentary space, particularly at the Middle East, and in many of your articles, you've been to the state of Israel a number of times, so have I. And so we decided maybe we delay a little bit just to see what happens with this war. We didn't know if it'd be another 12-day war. Now it's been, what has it been, 3 months now? So finally, John Davidson, you are here. I am here. The tech is working so far. So welcome, my friend. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm a big fan of your work, and it's an honor to be here.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. And likewise. So we are primarily today going to talk about your conversion. You converted from Protestantism, and we're going to talk about the implications of that conversion in your life, particularly with regard to Zionism and whatnot, and your evolving views on that and what we actually mean by that term. It's a notoriously ambiguous term. We can talk about that. And so we will have a lot of interesting things to talk about, and world events certainly seem to be conspiring to make it all the more interesting. As we're recording this, full-on hostilities have just begun again, apparently, between the United States and Iran. It's June 11th when we're recording this. So who knows where it'll be when we actually post this, hopefully pretty soon. It will be sometime this summer, but we'll see. But your patron saint is St. Andrew, mine is St. Ignatius of Antioch. So we'll open with a prayer, and then asking our patron saints and the guardian angels of yourself, myself, all the audience to guide our conversation and the understanding of it. So we'll go from there. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen. St. Andrew, pray for us.
Pray for us.
St. Ignatius of Antioch, pray for us.
Pray for us.
Guardian angels of John, myself, and all the audience members who will be listening to this, pray for us.
Pray for us.
In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. Before we get into today's episode, I wanted to thank Eternal Christendom's patrons. You are making it possible for us to produce beautiful, substantive content that we can then share with the world for free. If you have been blessed by Eternal Christendom's content but are not yet a patron, please check out our website, eternalchristendom.com, and click Become a Patron at the top right of our homepage, where you'll find 6 ways to give, including online. We have a big vision, but we need your help to make it happen. This podcast is just the beginning, and we have many enormous and exciting projects we are actually working on at this very moment. Since we are a nonprofit and we're also under priestly authority, all your donations are tax deductible. If a relatively small number of Catholics become monthly patrons for only $10 a month, as I say, a coffee and a bagel, at least here in California, we will be on solid ground for the long game, and we can do some of these big projects precisely because so many of you have been helping and make it possible for us to plan ahead and vision cast in a big way. If you can give more than $10 a month, even better. Thank you again for your support. Now to our episode. All right. Well, let's start with your conversion, your background, and when did you actually come into the church?
I came into the church. My wife and I both came in at Easter 2018 in at St. Mary Cathedral in Austin, Texas. That's the archdiocesan seat of the diocese there in downtown Austin. And we were both raised and grew up in non-denominational evangelical Protestant homes. And I can tell you the short version, and we can get into it more later. But the short version is that I think we both got to the end of Protestantism and realized it was going to be the Catholic Church or nothing, and I think that's a place that a lot of evangelicals get to. A priest friend of mine very insightfully told me once that Evangelicism is sort of it's the ramp off of Christianity into unbelief, and I think that's true. For us, though, it wasn't an intellectual journey to the Catholic Church. A lot of people, because of what I do, I'm a journalist. I wrote a book. I speak on podcasts and publicly all the time, and a lot of people I knew. And a lot of people who I didn't know just assumed that, I read enough Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine that I was persuaded.
Church fathers, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
The church fathers. And that played an important role, but it was not the incepting incident. That played an important role for us later on, in the process. What triggered it was really a crisis of faith and a family tragedy. In May of 2015, one of my older brothers was killed in a car accident suddenly. He had 3 small children, a wife, and he was killed in a car accident on a beautiful Sunday afternoon, so sort of out of nowhere, and it just sort of rocked the whole family. And for me and for my wife, it shocked us out of a kind of complacency about our faith, about our religious beliefs, about our practice of religion. We were, as I said, we were on the way to ceasing to practice religion at all. And part of that is because we had reached kind of the end of evangelicism. We had both kind of concluded that the evangelical form of Christianity has no roots, has no authority. It's sort of a warren of these different theories and interpretations of Scripture that really anyone's interpretation is just as valid as anyone else's, and there's no guardrails at all. And so we had kind of reached the end of that, and the whole like sort of praise and worship style of service and the preaching. And so we were never going to go back to an evangelical church. And this had been true for some years now. At the time, I think on holidays and other occasions, we were attending a Presbyterian church, not because we believed in Calvinist theology at all, but just because they had a nice choir. And so that was like our last line to organized Christianity. But we knew that there was no future in that as well. And so the death of my brother sort of shocked us out of this complacency and really this slow motion loss of religion. I remember my wife telling me later, a few days after the accident, that she had been on the phone with her sister earlier that day, completely randomly, and had this serious conversation with her sister, whom she's very close to, about how she needed to get her faith sorted out, and that she needed to get her mind made up about what she was going to do about her religious faith and how to practice it. And so
she said that before you guys heard about the accident?
She said that hours before the accident.
Wow.
And what happened, so this was up in Alaska where I live now, where my family's from, where I grew up, and my brother and his family were living up here at the time. So we came up from Texas and did the funeral, did the burial. We have a family cemetery here on our property. And a week later, I went back to work, and I was sitting at my desk. At the time I was working downtown in Austin at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. I was doing policy analysis for them and communications. And I was upset. I was still in a lot of pain, and I was grieving the loss of my brother and the circumstances of his death. And 2 blocks away is St. Mary's Cathedral. And at noon, the bells ring for noon mass every day. About 5 noon, the bells ring for mass that starts at 12:05. And on an impulse, without thinking about it, I got up from my desk and I walked down to the cathedral and slipped in the back and sat down. And I didn't go up for a blessing. I didn't talk to anybody. I just quietly sat there. On some level, I felt that God was there, Christ was there, and that's where I needed to be. Not for any intellectual reason, to comfort me in my distress. And the next morning, or the next day at noon, I got up and I did the same thing. And the next day, and the next day, and I did this for 2 months. Every day at noon, I went to mass. And I didn't tell my wife, because what church we were going to go to was something that we had quarreled about in the past. And finally, I had to tell her, and I said, I have to tell you something. I've been going to mass at noon every day for 2 months downtown. And
people need to understand, for people who grow up evangelical, it's almost like admitting an affair. It can be that bad to admit you went to a Catholic church.
I got to tell you something, honey.
Yeah. Among some evangelicals, not all, right. but among some. Yeah.
And the first thing she said was, "Can I come with you?"
Wow.
And after that point, we started attending together, and we attended on and off, and increasingly more frequently. And that in the fall of 2017, we entered the RCIA program, telling ourselves that we were just doing it to discern. We weren't making any commitments. It was just a discernment. But as the RCIA, as we went through the process and went through those rites, by about the time that Lent started, we said, we need to tell our families that we're going to be joining the church. And and it was a beautiful thing. It was a difficult thing, as you're a convert from Protestantism, so I'm sure you and others in the audience know what I'm talking about. When you tell family members who aren't Catholic, it can be a painful, a difficult thing for them. In my case, my oldest brother, who lives up here with his family in Alaska, he converted to Catholicism. Him and his wife became Catholic, I believe, in 2003. So
before you?
About 15 years before me.
Wow.
And so I joke with people that the hardest part about becoming a Catholic was losing a 15-year-old argument with your older brother.
Indeed.
But he was very supportive when we told him that this was happening, and so now our family and his family, which is the majority of our extended family, are all Catholic, and it's a beautiful thing. We moved up here 3 years ago from Texas, and we're part of a vibrant, wonderful parish here, and it's really, we can talk about, I don't want to go on too long of a monologue, but the longer that we're Catholic, the more. It's like it's like this unfolding thing that you realize that there's more and more to it, and there's more and more things to do to deepen your faith and to practice your faith, and piety. The word piety takes on a different connotation as well, because it becomes the goal in life. It becomes a way of life. And there's something that my late sister-in-law told me before we became Catholic, but while we were going through RCIA. She said that one of the beautiful things about becoming Catholic is that, which is different than Evangelicism, is that sanctification now is something that's possible to begin in this life on this earth, and that we can actually move toward sainthood during our lives. Of course, with the help of God's grace, and of course with the intercession of the saints. But it's something we can do, and so that has been, probably day to day, that's been one of the biggest changes from before I was Catholic to now.
Yeah, and I think there are certainly, some Protestants who take holiness very seriously,
Yeah.
I think I'm remembering J.I. Packer, great author. I think did he write it's been a long time, The Knowledge of God or something like that. He wrote a great book. Maybe there was one on the holiness of God as well. But you're right. In many Protestant circles, particularly in evangelical circles, there's this sense of our human nature is simply not capable of righteousness, and so that's when you redefine grace as simply a covering over instead of a transfiguration from within. So as merely, I don't want to downplay the forgiveness of sins. It's huge, but as merely the forgiveness of sins rather than the impartation of the divine life of God himself, which has consequences in the negative and the positive. The positive being, like you said, we actually can grow in genuine saintliness as a preparation for heaven.
That's
but on
right.
the negative, because God has renewed us, we are not the same, but we're in a similar position as Adam and Eve, where they were created in peace with God. And in that state of peace with God, they chose to rebel. They chose to disobey. And so can we. Even if we're in a state of grace, with our renewed will, we can say no to God. So yeah, absolutely. I had some other questions, but if you had a follow-up thought, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, to borrow a term from our Eastern brothers and sisters, the whole concept of theosis is kind of lacking in Protestantism at large and in non-denominational evangelicism in particular. That idea that we are in the process of being transformed, as you say, transfigured into a God-like being, not that we're being transformed into God, but that we are participating in the divine life of God, and that participation can have greater or lesser degrees, and it can grow or it can recede, and we participate in that process, and we're a part of it, and there are things that are asked of us in that, and that is. That's not how I was raised. That's not how a lot of evangelicals were raised, and so it's a radically different way of approaching the religious life. It's a radically different way of approaching all of life because, as I said before, the longer a person is Catholic, the more you realize that everything is implicated in life. It's not just how you worship or that you go to confession or do these other sacraments. Your whole imagination, your whole vision of reality and creation is transformed into something different. You take on a sacramental imagination, which is a radically different way of viewing the world.
Yeah, no, well said. And I do know there are, and I want to get into this because you mentioned kind of a way stop on Presbyterianism. Before I do, your comment reminds me of G.K. Chesterton, who said, I think it was in the Catholic Church and conversion, the church is bigger from the inside.
Yeah.
So like once you're in, it's something that I'm sure you were perhaps at first like afraid of. I was. When I started realizing I'd have to become Catholic, it was very depressing, very fear-inducing. Because one must come to terms with the fact that you've possibly been on the wrong team, as it were, your whole life. That Christ had so many more things for you that you never knew about. And not only did you never know about them, I'm giving my own personal reflections. If this is different than yours when you were going through, then just let us know. But not only that he had more for us, but that I was actively rejecting those things without realizing it, which is a very sobering reality.
Absolutely. One of the big hurdles, you mentioned being on the wrong side of things. As a sort of an adult or a middle-aged guy in your 30s or 40s, to convert to Catholicism from a Protestant background is to admit that you've been wrong about the biggest things in life. And for me, I was only going to, it took something like a crisis and a tragedy in my life to knock me out of that kind of prideful place where I was like, I'm not going to admit that I've been wrong about this. I'm not going to admit that I've been missing the main thing in life. And sometimes that's what it takes. And I'll say too that the process is one, to your point about the church being bigger from inside. One of the things my brother said to me, he compared it to, Bilbo Baggins going into Smaug's lair, his treasure hoard, and there's one little, when you first go in, say there's one little corner, and you dig through the treasure there, and you see, and it's amazing, and you're discovering all these things in this one little corner, and then you look out, and it opens up, and it's this vast sea of treasures that covers an area beyond what you can see, and realizing that's what the Catholic Church is. And I'm only ever going to dig through a small portion of it in my life, and there are treasures innumerable that have been waiting there the whole time. And I think for a lot of adult converts, especially from various sects of Protestantism, that's something like the experience of becoming Catholic, is realizing there's been these treasures here this whole time that I didn't know about, and it's more vast than I will ever discover in my life.
Yeah, and also dealing, I don't know what you had to deal with, but also dealing with the the reality, the reality of, I think many people who did it had good intentions, but the reality that I was actively dissuaded from these things for so long, from figures I trusted most. One figure who I have immense respect for in some ways, but one figure who comes to mind on this is John MacArthur. John MacArthur, I consulted on basically everything. I wasn't like a fully John MacArthurite kind of a person, but he was certainly one of the voices. If I was working through what does the Bible mean about this or whatever, he was certainly one of the voices I consulted. And as I was exploring the Church Fathers, I started listening more to his anti-Catholic sermons, like hoping, begging God, like, oh gosh, please don't have me convert, and thinking John MacArthur could provide a way out.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, especially after I'd been reading the Catechism, reading the Fathers, reading the actual councils, I was like, what he's saying about the church is just not true.
Yeah.
It's just not true.
I had the same experience. Yeah. I had the same experience, realizing once we kind of, once I moved from the sort of the crisis of the family tragedy and moved into, okay, there's something real here. Christ really is present in the Eucharist in a way that I can't explain, that I can hardly even articulate. Then the questions, and also the misinformation and the propaganda that I'd been given my whole life. And I wasn't a complacent evangelical. I did some Bible college. I studied the Bible. I was quite serious about it for a long time, and did missionary trips all over the world, and so on and so forth. But realizing that so much, almost everything that I had been told by Protestant leaders and pastors and other figures had been wrong, and that I had been misled. And I want to be clear, not necessarily always intentionally misled.
Sure.
I think a lot of this was sincere misinformation and sincere falsehood, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure.
But just, as I, because we started to drill down and explore these particular questions about theology and Catholic teaching and what we had thought was Catholic doctrine and what we thought how things worked. And one by one, the pins began to get knocked down. And one of the big realizations was that, man, almost everything that I had been taught as a Protestant about Catholic belief and Catholic teaching was wrong, and was a form of propaganda, of anti-Catholic propaganda. And I remember going at one point, prior to one of the rite of sending, or one of the rites in the RCIA process, my wife and I went to meet with the rector of the cathedral, who is a wonderful priest, who himself was a convert from Evangelicism, an adult convert from Evangelicism, who became a priest. And so in some ways, I viewed that as providential, that God had us at this cathedral with this pastor who could speak directly to our concerns. We said, okay, before we do this next stage of RCI, we got it. We have a list. We literally had a list written out of like questions, objections, different things that we felt that we had not been answered to our satisfaction. And we said, okay, so we made an appointment. We met with him and explained why we were there. And I said, first of all, I said, first on the list, I said something about the real presence. And he said, he had the best way of responding to us because he knew where we were coming from. And he said, let me ask you, he's like, when you come into the sanctuary, do you genuflect? And I said, yes. And he said, why? And I kind of nodded. And in that moment, I realized I had nothing to say except because I was like, because Jesus is there. And he said, that's right. He said, if you were not persuaded that Jesus was there, you wouldn't genuflect. And as you know, and I tried to ask a few more questions. I said, okay, let's move on to this other thing. And as we went through, I realized that my objections were like a 5-year-old, complaining or asking questions to an adult, and that so many of my questions had already been answered, and that I had already had peace with them. And through that process, we realized that we as adult converts and as people who were looking to join the church were never going to intellectually be able to get answers to every single question that we had about the Catholic Church or about Catholic teaching before, as a condition of us becoming Catholic, because in part, the Catholic Church has something to say about everything, about every aspect of life, about every aspect of the spiritual life, about how one should live, about what death is, about what heaven and hell are. That if we were going to wait until we were satisfied, until our intellects were fully satisfied, that was going to be a trap that would keep us out of the church forever. And we had to, at some point, you do have to make a leap of faith. There's a wonderful essay by a guy named Sheldon Van Auken, who wrote a very famous book called A Severe Mercy, about the death of his wife. This was a student of C.S. Lewis, and the phrase "a severe mercy" came from one of C.S. Lewis's letters to him, saying that the death of his wife was a severe mercy for him because it was bound up with the salvation of his soul. Later in life, after he was a famous author, he became a Christian at Oxford, partly through the discipleship of C.S. Lewis, and he was Anglican. He became an Anglican, and then later in life, in his 40s or 50s, he converted to Catholicism. And he has a beautiful essay about this image of sitting on the cliffs of Dover, on the white cliffs of Dover, on England's shore, and looking to Rome, and knowing that is where his home was, but it was painful for him because he knew he would have to leave the shores. He knew he would have to swim and leave England and the Anglican Church behind. And he felt like at some point, another image he said in that essay was that he felt like somebody who had walked out across a pond or a stream on stepping stones and was in the middle and was caught and couldn't turn around to go back, but was afraid to go forward, and that's where he was. And we kind of realized that in this endless questioning of what about this and what about that and what about this, that we were in danger of getting caught like that, unable to go backwards, unable to go forwards, and that what God was asking of us was to trust His church and to make a kind of leap of faith, because our intellects are only going to take us so far. And I know maybe that sounds a little bit, for a Catholic crowd, a little bit anti-intellectual. I assure you it's not. But I think that's part of the process of being an adult convert from Protestantism, is like letting go of what you think you should have as satisfaction to the millions of questions that you could pose.
Yeah, no, that's well said. I think it's a very common experience. And no, it's not anti-intellectual at all, because if you're Catholic, you accept that there are some things we can know only through revelation.
Yeah.
And that revelation is not anti-intellectual. It's kind of the analogy I've liked using is if you were God, we believe as Catholics that by reason we can determine that you exist and certain attributes and whatnot. So I can see you, I can see John, whatnot. But there are things I can only know about you if you tell me.
Right.
If you tell me. Like, I will not know them about you, your inner life, unless you tell me. And so what we accept by faith is what God has disclosed to us about His inner life. And of course, with the church, the means by which He discloses it in the fullest sense. Obviously, Scripture is part of it, whatnot. and somebody can have scripture outside the visible bounds of the church, but all of it is ordered for the church. And so that's why, it's not anti-intellectual for me to believe what you tell me about your inner life, assuming you're trustworthy, which God is.
Right.
And so that in no way contradicts what I can discern about you without you disclosing anything to me. So yeah, that's why it's not anti-intellectual at all.
Right. And
some of these things. Oh, sorry.
Well, I was as you were talking, I was reminded of something that Father Carlos Martins, who's an exorcist, he does the exorcist, kind of I guess a celebrity exorcist. There's a lot of those. He said in a lecture, the other thing that Father Martins does is relic tours and relic talks. I think he's in charge, or one of the people in charge of the Vatican relics, and he takes some of them on tour from time to time. And there's these talks that you can find on YouTube. And one of the things he said in a talk that has stuck with me that is related to what you're saying is that he said, we don't know why God has chosen to dispense his grace and reveal himself in miraculous deeds through the relics of his saints. We only know that he has chosen to do that. And that I thought was as good of an explanation of relics as we can have with our limited knowledge of the cosmos and our limited knowledge of the mind of God. We can't know exactly why. We can only know that God has chosen to do this. And the proof certainly in Father Martin's case is in the pudding. Like the proof is in the miracles that come from these relics.
Well, and in the case with the church, I mean, there's 1,000 proofs that could be marshaled in its favor, but and none of them are syllogistic, right? They are motives of credibility, as the church calls it. And one of them is that Catholic Church has been around for 2,000 years. You know, what's interesting to me is many non-religious people talk about the Catholic Church. They'll say, "Oh, it's been around for 2,000 years." Like they have no problem acknowledging that because it's simply a fact of history. It's simply a fact of history. We can literally, one of our study banks on the Eternal Christian website, I provide the list of all the successors of various bishops provided in Eusebius of Caesarea's ecclesiastical history. Just to show people, they kept the list. We know who succeeded from the apostles, preeminently St. Peter in Rome. We can trace it back to Christ himself. If you want to have a theological discussion about the authority claims, fine. But the visible society governed by the successor of Peter preeminently and governed by the successors of the apostles, we know where that is, and we can trace it back to Christ himself. There's no question about this. And so I actually wanted to share with you, you had mentioned about, I pulled up the oath that I came into the church with, which was adapted from the Creed of Pius IV, because you talked about coming in at middle age and it being sort of an act of repentance. The very opening line, I came in at 31 in July 2019, so I came in a year later than you. The very opening line is, I, Joshua Charles, 31 years of age, born outside the Catholic Church, have held and believed errors contrary to her teaching. Now, enlightened by divine grace, I kneel before you, Reverend Father, having before my eyes and touching with my hand the Holy Gospels, and with firm faith I believe and profess, and then go through all the various items, but have held and believed errors contrary to her teaching. So, I had to admit that. It was a great abjuration on my part,
Yeah. So it's hard for people to do that. I can see that in my own life. I know people that some form of that is keeping them back, is holding them back. And, it's a hard thing to ask someone to do and it's a hard thing to do yourself. And I think that's why for a lot of people there has to be some incepting incident. There has to be some shakeup. There has to be something that causes you to be in dire straits, to get you to that point of humility, to be like, okay, I don't know everything. Maybe I have received errors. Maybe I have believed things that were not true. And if I'm wrong, then it's my responsibility to do something about it. And
well, and this goes against the whole spirit of our age, which is I get to decide what is true in matters of my faith.
That's right.
That's the whole spirit of our age. It's the air we breathe. One quick clarification, because I wanted to dive into a little bit about what you were finding you and your wife are finding so convincing about evangelicalism. But one quick clarification, you said your late sister-in-law. So did your sister-in-law and those 3 kids die in the car accident as well?
No, I was referring to my my older brother who is Catholic, who is still alive.
Oh.
His wife died of cancer in February
no.
2024.
Wow.
They have 8 kids,
Wow.
and one who just graduated, the oldest just graduated from my alma mater, Hillsdale College, and
wonderful.
The youngest, our godson, is 6. So that was a big, we moved up here. We had already planned to move up here before she found out about her diagnosis. But yeah, that was another big
Wow.
big event in the family. She died, after about a year's battle with colon cancer, and she was in her 40s, so it was a case of a younger person getting colon cancer, and but she was a faithful Catholic, and she received last rites, and she was a daily communicant in the months before her death, and so that was, but she was her and my brother, who are Catholic, they came into the church together shortly after they were married back in, I believe, 2003. And so they had sort of we had this ongoing kind of dialogue with them for years and years about the Catholic faith. And, and so when we told them that we were going through RCIA, they were very supportive, very enthusiastic. And it was nice to have a family member who was sort of on our side, praying for us, cheering us on, giving us reading suggestions. Because as you probably know, one of the tough things for an adult convert is family members who aren't Catholic, are indifferent to Catholicism, or are actively hostile to it. And that can be,
and friends.
And friends and colleagues and all that. And that's also a hurdle that you have to kind of get over and say, whatever the awkward conversations, the shouting and the tears, whatever comes, it you must needs come. But I have to move forward with this.
Yeah.
One of the things you said you were just saying about the list of bishops and the successors to the apostles, and even non-Catholics saying, "Oh yeah, the Catholic Church has been around for 2,000 years." It always struck me the way that evangelicals and Protestants, more broadly, and I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush. I know this is not true for certain sects of Lutheranism, but they act as though there were no Christians until the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, as though
or it had all but disappeared. The true faith had all but disappeared.
And that almost that like Martin Luther and John Calvin and King Henry VIII received some new, almost like Joseph Smith type of revelation that revived Christianity that had been dormant for 1,500 years. I always thought that was a very bizarre thing, that you have to ignore 1,500 years of Christian history and miss out on all of it in order to sort of say that you're a follower of Jesus. Like that. Yeah. Speaking of anti-intellectualism, that just strikes me as deeply wrong. And I remember reading a book when I was maybe you'll identify this. One of the things about becoming a Catholic as an adult is that you're able to look back through your life and see the breadcrumbs and see the hand of providence at work in all of these different ways, not just, in my case, not just with the death of my brother, but going back years and years. I think when I was 19 years old, my dad, of all people, who's not Catholic and he's not Orthodox, sent me a book by, I believe the man's name is Thomas Howard, called Evangelical. Evangelical is Not Enough. Yeah, my dad sent me that book when I was in college, and I read it. I remember thinking this makes a lot of sense. What's going on with evangelical? And so and then that's really when I began to separate myself from an evangelical kind of way of worshiping, an evangelical way of being. And it was while I was reading that book, I was going to an evangelical college in Hawaii at the time, and I stopped attending like the chapel at the college, and I didn't tell anybody at school. I secretly began attending a mass in town. I didn't know anybody. I didn't
even in college.
Yeah, this was
Wow.
and I did that for the year or so that I was there, and then I
Wow.
I
That's a
stopped
long
doing
time
it
to
and
go to
went away.
mass. Wow.
Yeah, and part of the reason I didn't pursue it is that there was no social permission in my life at the time to dabble in that or to look into that, and so I kind of just did it surreptitiously.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, it's interesting to see how like these things have been percolate and for years and years, that there were these threads that go back that are easier to see now, of course, than they were at the time. But there was always a hand of providence there, I believe, guiding us toward the Catholic Church and the true faith.
Yeah, 100%. And yeah, it's interesting when you say, because I think, especially now, I don't know about you. Well, when I was coming into the church in 2019, it certainly didn't feel like there was a groundswell of conversions. It felt very lonely. I didn't see anybody else I really knew posting about the church fathers. I was posting quotes. I was reading from them all the time. People who know my conversion story, I basically made it a full-time job, 10 to 12 hours a day of reading for a year or so. And then since then, it's not 10 to 12 hours, but it's a lot every day in the work we're doing with Eternal Christendom. But now there is, but I think part of it is because so many people have been diving into the church fathers and realizing this is nothing like the Christianity I was told was true. It just isn't. And again, there is a spectrum of Protestant sects, and you and I both acknowledge that. So for the rest of the podcast episode, everybody should just assume when we say Protestant, we recognize there's diversity. The Anglicans, the Lutherans, even some Presbyterians. I don't know how they do, frankly, but they would claim, we don't think there was a 1,500-year gap, and even a lot of evangelicals won't claim that.
But they act.
But what I realized was that. Some of them do, but what I realized when I dove into the church fathers is literally all of my Christian ancestors were wrong about fundamentals, or I am. And so whether I stated it explicitly or not, I realized when I actually dove into the history that if I was to maintain my Protestantism, I had to assume that there was in fact some sort of great falling away at some point, because even when all the fathers didn't, because Catholic doctrine develops, it gets more precise. This is what all the councils are for. Even the Council of Nicaea was a clarification of doctrine. And after that declaration,
counter heresies.
Right. There was a new standard. You had to use terms like homoousios in the creed. You had to describe Jesus in a particular way to be considered a Catholic in good standing. And so this keeps happening. So even when there were some issues that the fathers were still wrestling with, that the church, a millennia later settled finally, the entire framework of the fathers was Catholic. Like, if there's going to be a resolution of this, it's going to be done by the successors of the apostles and preeminently the successor of Peter in Rome. That's where the resolution will come from.
Yes.
So even like the framework of like how we resolve these questions was Catholic. It was nothing like Presbyterianism. It was nothing like Lutheranism. It was nothing like Anglicanism, which,
that's right.
We get this national episcopacy that's somehow separated from the rest. It's very odd. I was open to Anglicanism because I just had this lifelong, I wouldn't call it hatred, but dislike of the papacy. And I was grasping for alternatives. But the more I read the fathers, I was like, there's nothing in here like Anglicanism, like this idea that there can be some nationally associated episcopacy that's separated from the rest as a matter of principle. It's very odd, very odd.
It's totally odd. And I think one of the solutions that some Protestants come up with for that problem is that they'll point to a period in history in antiquity, let's say, the conversion of Constantine, right? And the ending of Rome's persecution of Christians. And they'll say everything after that, from the reign of Constantine, to Martin Luther, is not real Christianity. And the only real Christianity was, the first 300 years. And so we got to get back to early Christianity. And so you begin, and I grew up in like home churches and different iterations of small groups and meeting in gymnasiums or strip malls, and you end up having a mentality where there's a kind of obsession with having to reverse engineer what you think Christianity must have been in the early church. And there's a trope that, in Protestantism, every man is his own pope, but there's also this like anxiety that I have to learn Greek and Latin and Hebrew. I have to I have to memorize all the texts. I have to delve into the etymology of all these terms. I have to memorize all the, historical and archaeological timelines, and as though they're living in the rubble of a nuclear holocaust, and they have to sort of like piece together the fragments of this religion from ancient times. It's an incredible amount of like psychological pressure to do that, and I bought into that. Or I learned Hebrew. I minored in ancient Greek. And part of my motivation for that was that, well, if I went to Bible college, and my motivation was I have to know these languages, otherwise I can't be a sincere Christian. I have to know Scripture backwards and forwards, otherwise I can't be a sincere Christian. And I realized later that the mentality was one of we have to sort of we have to reverse engineer true Christianity, and we can't rely on tradition, because that wasn't real Christianity. In retrospect, it sounds crazy, but that's really, I think, what's going on, and what motivates a lot of obsessive scripture study, what motivates a lot of the language study, and what motivates there's real fervor there, but it's fervor that's driven by an anxiety about having no roots and no tradition. And I also think that's why some evangelicals will look back to Judaism and will glom on to aspects of the Torah and aspects of Old Testament Judaic law, and even want to like incorporate those things into because at least it's a tradition. At least it's something that's in the Bible, that's a tradition that they think they can claim as their own. And in so doing, I think that I think they deny Christ, and I think that they get a lot of big things wrong and put themselves in danger. But I think that's why you see that.
Oh, we'll get into that, John. We'll get into that. I know this. I want to ask you something about this, because I was actually going to ask about this very issue with respect to your father, who's still not Catholic to this day, giving you a book by a Catholic convert saying evangelicalism is not enough. I've read the Howard books, great stuff. Before I do that, I do feel it's important. I don't think we're being too negative. I think this is just truth, and people, I hope, consider it or not. But I do want people to know that I am genuinely very, very thankful, and I suspect you are as well.
Oh, yeah.
For two great things I received as a Protestant, and mostly evangelical, though I was kind of more in the high church end a bit toward the end. And that's a belief that truth is real, and that the Bible is God's word. It's inerrant, it's inspired, whatnot. And both invariably led me to the Catholic Church for reasons I've explained many places, and I'll be explaining in more detail elsewhere in the future. But the truth is real part is extremely important. It sounds like utterly obvious, and like it's like, well, duh. It's like, well, no, duh, because if truth is real and it doesn't depend on opinion, then how can Christians claim truth is real, and yet we're contradicting each other constantly on utter basics of the faith? Things as simple as, how do we worship? Can you lose your salvation? Basic moral teachings. That was the reality I was confronted with all the time. Sounds like with you as well. Yeah. And in high school, I'm a little bit younger than you, but in high school, I would talk with my atheist or agnostic secular friends, and we would debate moral relativism all the time. And I would, of course, say, no, morals are absolute. There's an absolute objective standard that we will be held accountable to. It comes from God, etc. And they would, of course, take the opposite. And I would get them. One, I got to admit that, an event like the Holocaust had been a horrific tragedy. It was evil. But I said, but in your framework, the most you can say about it is you prefer it not happen. That's all you can say. And he had the honesty to admit that that was true. He had the honesty to admit that that was true, which I respected. I was horrified, but I respected it. So, but I realized that many of the people, like Nancy Pearcey is a great voice. She wrote Total Truth. I read that when I was in either late high school or college. Great lady. I think she's a Baptist. Saving Leonardo did a great book on art. So there are these great evangelical voices who are talking about and confronting relativism.
Yeah.
But what I realized, so I'm very thankful for them. I'd love to talk with Pearcey at some point. Great woman. But I realized, oh my goodness, we're telling the atheists they're wrong for being relativists on things like morals. But then when I turn around, we're being relativists, not on morals. Well, sometimes on morals, but on the very things Christ died and rose again to reveal to us.
Yep.
And that increasingly just didn't make any sense to me. That didn't make any sense to me. Yeah. Go ahead.
And I think that because of that is, this happened in the 70s and 80s, sort of began in the 60s with the mainline Protestant churches beginning to compromise on their morals and their doctrine, right? I think the one leads to the other, and that the relativism that's there, that's sort of like native to Protestantism, eventually manifests itself. Eventually, it's going to affect doctrine and teaching. Eventually, it's going to affect biblical interpretation. It happened with the mainline first, and we see it now happening with evangelical churches and evangelical leaders. Megan Basham, who herself is a Protestant, had a great book last year, Shepherds for Sale, about sort of left-wing moral relativism creeping into these evangelical organizations. You see it with figures like Russell Moore in Christianity Today, adopting kind of, following the path that was blazed by the Protestant mainline at the end of the last century. I think it's inevitable that when you have at the heart of your sort of religious cosmology or your theological framework, that there is no real authority beyond the believer's conscience and their interpretation, or just once removed, say like, if the authority isn't the believer's conscience, then it's like a majority of elders that were elected in a local church, or that were appointed by a prince, and having a state crown episcopacy type of a thing with the Anglican Church, then you have the relativity, both theological and eventually moral, baked in. And so it's only a matter of time before that's going to manifest itself. And I think that in the end, you're going to have a world where you have Catholic and Orthodox on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have either atheists, secular materialists, or some form of neo-pagans on the other hand. And they may, like the modern Episcopalians, call themselves Christian, but in effect they're sort of neo-pagan or neo-Gnostic, given what the details might be.
Yeah, and you probably know this line from Tocqueville. I don't remember the exact quote, but he observed in Democracy in America essentially that America would end up Catholic or atheist.
Yes,
because Protestantism did not have the internal resources to remain coherent. And yeah, by the way, I love Megan. If she ends up watching this, we've done some great rosary campaigns for her. Prayed for her conversion to Catholic faith, of course, but also for healing from her cancer. Yes. She's a sweet, sweet woman. I think she's very brave. I think she's totally right on a lot of issues. So Megan would welcome a conversation if you see this at some point. But I do think a lot of her convictions only find rest and coherence in the Catholic faith. And some may object, and I understand the objection. Well, there's tons of liberalism in the Catholic Church, and you're right, and there is. But here's the fundamental distinction. As you said, the locus of authority in the Catholic Church is not the individual conscience. The conscience is important in Catholic theology, but it is not the end-all, be-all. There is an authority to bind and loose, and even popes are bound by that authority. If a pope cannot undo what was formally defined by Nicaea or Chalcedon or Vatican I or Trent or whatever. He cannot do that. And not even everything a pope says is considered authoritative in the Catholic Church. That's something many Catholics need to increasingly realize as well in this age of the media papacy, where popes get interviewed, they do lots of events, it can get a broadcast all over the world. It's like, yeah, this is fine, I guess, but the vast majority, I mean, even in the latest encyclical, the Pope didn't really lay down anything new that was authoritative. He literally said, I'm just offering this as a reflection in this dialogue. And he articulated some infallibly true realities of the faith but just because he wasn't defining them, they'd have already been defined, and he was just re-articulating them. And so there is a lot of them, you'll always find Judas elements in the church. It's been happening since Judas, as it turns out. But we do not identify the locus of authority with Father James Martin, for example, or
anyone else. I mean, I guess you and I both came into the church as converts during the Francis pontificate, and so that was a difficult time for precisely what you're referencing.
Indeed.
Sort of off the cuff remarks that seem to contradict Catholic teaching, and yet people have asked me about this before, and I say it wasn't. It certainly wasn't because of Pope Francis that I became Catholic. It was oftentimes in spite of the things that he would say off the cuff, as not speaking ex cathedra, not speaking with the authority of the church, but just speaking, as a man, as a pastor, as a fallible person, and sort of realizing like there's. Sometimes Protestants will scoff if you say that the Catholic Church isn't a cult of personality, but it's really not, because we're insulated from. I mean, a cult of personality is a Benny Hinn or one of these like televangelists, or one of these Protestant teachers who have a following that are centered around their person and their charisma and their operation or whatever. We are thankfully we don't have to rely on anything like that. And even in the face of what for me was a difficult pontificate. I never thought twice about not becoming a Catholic because of something Pope Francis said. And if you recall, we came in at Easter 2018. That summer is when the McCarrick scandal broke.
And summer of shame.
And that November, I went to the USCCB meeting in Baltimore, which began by, I believe it was Cardinal Supich stood up and read a letter from Rome saying that the USCCB was not to produce any statement or weigh in on the McCarrick situation at all. And it was a very kind of a scandalous time. And here I am, a brand new Catholic, covering this. And it was sobering for me to see how individually unimpressive the members of the American Episcopate were, that these were administrators, these were company men, these are not great men of faith, and realizing like, okay, and I was thankful for it, because it was a gut check moment where I was like, all right, this is really your church, Lord, and we don't.
And mine. I mean, mine in the sense of belonging to it.
Right, and I don't have to rely on the piety of these, oftentimes foolish and ignorant and vain men to for the integrity of your church to be maintained, and for your church to sort of continue on in its mission throughout the world to save the world and bring the sacraments. And the sacraments don't even depend. The oldest heresy, Donatism. The sacraments don't depend on the piety of the ministers either.
It was one of the oldest heresies. One
of the oldest. But it was a good reminder. It was a good reminder, seeing, kind of coming face to face with the hierarchy of the church and seeing how dismal it was, and in some ways remains.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, because I mean, it really does come down to, when Jesus calls himself the Good Shepherd, do you believe he is the true head and shepherd of his church? And as an evangelical, I would sometimes try to act as if the word institution was a bad thing, but then I would turn, and this is, I don't know about you, once I started being just simply open-minded to hearing the Catholic Church herself, not go off the tropes I had heard, not go off the misrepresentations from others, but just go to the source. which I realized was actually required by the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
Right.
I realized I had never heard the Catholic Church. And it's like, well, if I was accused, would I want to be heard? Yeah, I would. And it'd be perfectly just for me to be heard.
Yeah.
And so the fact that I had not heard the Catholic Church, the fact that I hadn't listened to it yet, what I realized was an act of injustice on my part, whether I became Catholic or not, right?
Yeah.
And so, but there's this, but the integrity of the church, it's like this would have swamped virtually any sect I was part of before I was Catholic. Bad leadership like this on occasion.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
A lot of these congregations don't even exist anymore. They're gone. Sometimes whole denominations have disappeared, or the denomination A disappears and B and C have now taken its place. And so, but here it is, 2,000 years later, and church fathers. This could be a whole other topic, but just a very quick point here is St. Augustine talks about this a lot. Many other church fathers talk about this. St. Augustine explicitly points to, I think it's Matthew 19, where our Lord talks about, obey those who sit on the seat of Moses, but do not do what they do. And St. Augustine connects this with the reality of the church. Like, Christ provided for the stability of the church and its teaching here. He said, follow those who sit on the seat of Moses, but do not do what they do. Okay, there it is. And it's still here 2,000 years later. That is not either it's satanic power or divine power. It's one or the other. It's not human power that is achieving that.
There's a I'm going to botch it. It's some 14th century text relaying a series of anecdotes about the church in which
the Decameron.
Yes, the Decameron.
Yes, I think I know the story you're talking about, but go ahead.
Where a man is speaking to a Jewish friend who goes to Rome, and he comes and he sees the decadence and the corruption of Rome, and he goes back to his friend is concerned that he won't believe because he's seen how terrible the Pope and the bishops are in Rome. And he says the Jewish.
Well, don't leave out the predicate. He was at the point of being willing to become Catholic after a long series of conversations.
Right.
And then he's like, but before I do, let me visit Rome. And then the guy's like, oh no.
And he says, look, essentially, I'm paraphrasing, but any church that's full of such, crooks and knaves must be led by the Holy Spirit to survive this long. But I to that point, I don't believe that any church that I attended growing up still exists. They're all gone. And it's no surprise to me that they are. And it's no surprise to me that the mainline churches are disappearing. I tell people, when we're old men, the Episcopal Church of the United States is going to be a bank account, and that's about it. There won't be any actual Episcopalians left. It will cease to exist. And that's that. I think that's the nature of it.
Yeah. So before we get into this, well, I mostly wanted to cover Zionism and the current geopolitics of the Middle East and how your conversion has affected your views of that. Maybe toward the end, maybe this could be another interview. We get a little bit into, the founding, the American founding, because if you're anything like me, becoming Catholic, I was already reassessing it a bit before becoming Catholic, but becoming Catholic kind of put that into overdrive as well. And by the way, patriotism is a virtue. So I love our country. You love our country. If it's under genuine threat, I would die for it. So we're patriots. We love our country. There's so much about our Constitution that I think is lovable and respectable and worthy of preserving. While there's other parts I don't think are, but we can talk about that. Not to get the cart too far ahead of the horse here, but the accusation anti-Semitism is thrown out very loosely these days, sometimes deservedly, but not really. I don't even like the term anymore for a variety of reasons. I just say hatred of Jews to refer to what I mean when that's an actual sin. But I often joke that, man, by the current standards of what anti-Semitism means, the prophets of Israel are anti-Semites because of all their criticism of Israel.
Right.
So I say that not to go too into that issue just yet, but to say with America, you can have criticisms of the United States and our founding, at least our founding continental regime, right? Like the United States. Well, I mean, the United States is certainly a particular political entity, but like America is more than just a particular founding regime that was written in 1787, inaugurated in 17. You know what I mean? Yep. And so you can criticize these things without being anti-American, just like the prophets of Israel criticize Israel more than anybody else and we're neither anti-Semitic nor Jew haters.
I mean,
So-
arguably, you criticize your country out of love, the same
Yeah.
way that you may correct or want to criticize a family member. That the prophets of Israel loved Israel; they wanted Israel to follow God and not to perish. And I think the same can be true when you look at our founding, and I think there's a kind of like academic autistic impulse on the right to only look at the founding, like only look at the text of the Constitution and the Declaration, and not to look at the civilization and the culture and the societies that produced those texts, to sort of have a fuller understanding of what it was, what had happened, in the century prior to the Declaration, the century plus prior to the Declaration on these shores, and what had happened in England to produce this regime and to produce this system of government. One of the books I'm reading through, I'm not all the way through it yet because it's quite a large tome, is Albion's Seed by David Hackett Fisher, which is about 4 British folkways in America. It's a book that came out, I believe, in 1989, a seminal work of history about colonial America. Following the 4 British folkways are the Puritans of New England, the Cavaliers of Virginia, the Quakers of Pennsylvania, and then the Scots-Irish of Appalachia. And his argument is that these 4 folkways created a distinctly American culture and civilization that was picked up wholly intact from different regions of England, and Britain, and planted in these different geographical locations in America that determined what the American culture was at its founding. And it's a remarkable read that along with becoming Catholic is helping, because when you become Catholic as an adult, you do have to kind of revisit your view of the founding and rethink kind of what it is that we got right and what it is that we got wrong, hopefully without going full Patrick Deneen, not to get too
hopefully you and I may have some differences there, but yeah, keep going.
I said full Patrick Deneen, maybe
all
not
right, well.
all the way, because I think that there is I don't think that you can dismiss the founding as a sort of liberal French Enlightenment revolution against established order. I tend to side and more with Edmund Burke, who understood the founding as a conservative reaction against royal innovation, and that what the founders understood that they were doing, and not just the founders, but sort of the generation leading up to the founders, that they were free Englishmen who had ancient rights that did not come from Parliament, and that did not even come from the crown, and that they were vindicating those rights by declaring independence after their efforts to redress, all efforts at redress for a long period of time, had failed. In other words, their understanding of their rights came out of Merry England. It came out of Catholic England and Magna Carta and the centuries of religious Catholic society that had built up these ideas and had built up this structure in English society, out of which came the culture of the Chesapeake, the culture of Massachusetts Bay, and even the bizarre Quaker culture of Pennsylvania to some extent, but certainly of Virginia and certainly of Massachusetts. This was not a radical break and a declaration of of libertinism and the reign of reason. It was nothing like the French Revolution. So I think that often we can conflate the revolutions and the Enlightenments, and we can read into the American Revolution too much of the Continental Enlightenment and not enough of the actual organic English culture that was informing the founding. And so sorry for that. Maybe I'm going off on a tangent
this is great
here, but
no, this is great. No, was that it?
Yeah, I guess I'm just saying there's an argument to be made, and we can't make it fully here. There's an argument to be made
Sure.
that America is not as Protestant of a nation as it is in our popular mythology. We're told, oh, America was a Protestant nation. America was founded by Protestants. America came out of Protestant thought, and it's just basically John Locke and Thomas Jefferson, and that's it. I think that's an oversimplification that doesn't take into account that not even getting into the Catholic history of America and the Catholicism that was native to different parts of what became America in Florida, in the West, in the South, but actually the Catholicism that was latent in English civilization that would form the foundation of American civilization. I think that gets short shrift. And I think that we are too quick to kind of buy into what is a kind of pro-Protestant, anti-Catholic, just so story about America's founding
Sure.
That distorts it.
I think there's a lot of that's true, and you're right. We we won't have time today to dive into all this, but I think we probably should at some point. I'd love to have you back on to do an even deeper dive. But yeah, I'll take a little foray into this, given my background in this, if that's all right. And I'd love your reaction, and your visceral critiques if you have them. It's more fun that way. No, I think that's generally right. I do think there is an attempt by some Catholics to overdo this. There are John Adams is my favorite founding father. By far, intellectually, I think he's the most intellectually grounded of all the founding fathers.
I agree.
Again, by far. Other founding fathers were brilliant, and their brilliance led them into issues on the evil side as well on occasion. But Adams, I think, was the most prophetic. I think he understood human nature the best. Just a brilliant man. But he also came from a Puritan background. He hated the Catholic Church. He eased up a little bit on it as he got older and was a little bit more ecumenical, to use that word that is so abused and misused these days. But the reason I point to Adams is because there are a whole series of quotes from Adams and Jefferson and other founders as well. But even from Adams, where he is very clear that he conceives of the American Revolution as inaugurating a new epoch in history, and one that's fundamentally different from the Christendom that preceded it. Like he literally says this. He talks about in one of his essays. It's from the 1760s. Many people haven't read it. The dissertation on the canon and the feudal law. I think there's four of them. He basically ascribes an infernal conspiracy, I think that's his term, to the forces of church and state that had conspired in Europe to basically keep humanity down forever. And that God in his wisdom raised up the Reformation to start dealing with this, and what the reformers did in religion, we're going to do in politics. I mean, he says things like this very openly. For someone as conservative and relatively speaking grounded as John Adams. And so there was a dialogue he wrote in his later life. It remained in his private documents, I believe. I think it was in his private documents. We can double check later, but it was like a dialogue between Charlemagne and Pope Leo III, who coronated Charlemagne on Christmas Day 800. I know you know that, but just for the audience who may not know. And it's basically them like concocting this scheme to basically hold down Europe and whatnot, which of course is absurd. And totally ignores the fact of how much the papacy, there were definitely problems sometimes, but actually held back a lot of tyranny as well. That's an untold historical story that needs to be told. Maybe it's a book I write in the second life. I oftentimes feel I need to do everything I need to do. Yeah. I'm sure you feel the same way. But anyway, so I do think it's a mixed bag. There are elements of our founding that I think are very commendable. That are very reasonable. I even in high school. Okay, I'm going to say something. We're recording this at least before the 250th. I've always loved July 4th, and I respect the founders. But even in high school, I never quite thought the revolution was justified. I had a great AP US history teacher who we're still friends. She's an evangelical, we would study that in detail. She loves America, and I love America too, but I was maybe a little bit more skeptical of some things. And I said, is that it? We were going into the documents and reading the stuff. And yeah, I thought there were some abuses, but to justify an entire revolution, I was not convinced. And this was as a Protestant, as an evangelical, as a dyed-in-the-wool, kind of Reaganite, yeah, America kind of guy. I just wasn't convinced, even as a Protestant, many, many years before I became Catholic. And as a Catholic, I've become even less convinced that the revolution was justified. I mean, John, I don't know about you. If I compare my tax rates now with what we paid under the George III, it's like radically worse. And just to kind of, anyway, I'll shut up for a bit and see what you would say to that.
No, I think it is a very deep conversation. It's and it's
we can't do it justice right now.
We can't do it justice here. I will say your comments about Adams. I agree with you about Adams being the most intellectually serious of the founders, and yet. And the most sort of conservative, and yet there is this kind of radicalism in their writings that is, I think, was part of the ferment of the time, and I think that they, I'm blanking on who said this now, but that the founders built better than they knew, and they were drawing on things, I think, that they were not always explicitly recognized.
Sure.
So the founders may not have read Aquinas, but they read people who read Aquinas, and that they are indebted for a lot of their ideas in very fundamental ways to Catholic Christendom, to Catholic natural law, and to the scholastics, even though that debt is never acknowledged in their writings. And so I think that we have to, go on more than just the letters and the missives that they wrote, and understand, the full context of where they got their ideas, maybe in ways that they themselves didn't fully acknowledge or didn't want to acknowledge. The idea that the Catholic Church in Europe had conspired to suppress the rights of man, with apologies to John Adams, is absolutely nonsense. It's complete nonsense. The default condition for the European continent prior to the Catholic Church was slavery, and it's a great book by Hilaire Belloc, wonderful Catholic writer, called "The Servile State," where
an Englishman.
An Englishman, a Frenchman, and an Englishman, where he talks about this, about
I'm
how
choosing to focus on just the Englishman part, John. So just
where the Catholic Church was the one thing that was able to sort of slowly emancipate Europeans from this state of pagan slavery. And it was because of the claims of the Catholic faith and the claims of Catholic natural law and Catholic theology about man and about society that was able to do that. And so the founders, to the extent that they think, what John Adams said, what you referenced, they're just simply wrong about that, And so, and I don't know that how aware they were of how wrong they were. And so
they weren't. That's the short answer. They weren't.
They weren't.
They were very convinced in their wrongness on some matters. Yeah,
but at the same time, they built something here that was indebted to the Catholic Church and to Catholic Europe in ways that they refused for various reasons, whether it was intellectual pride or ignorance or just prejudice, that they would not acknowledge. But I think we can acknowledge that and say, indeed, they built better than they knew, and that there is a kind of Catholic DNA to what we have here in America. We do not have a fundamentally revolutionary regime here. We have one that is fundamentally conservative, and in some ways is Catholic.
Man, because I can agree with that statement under some aspects, but not under others. Let me give an example of both. While we're doing this little colloquy here, one example where I can't agree with that is the checks and balances, and I'm not fully convinced in the separation of powers as far as each being co-equal. I'm not fully convinced of that idea yet, but a mixed regime is certainly. I mean, Polybius, the Greek historian, I'm sure you know, when he's considering how this one little city-state, Rome, came to dominate the Mediterranean, he ultimately identifies the causes in Rome's constitution and its balancing of all the various interests of society. And he describes it's not the American Constitution, but it's you've got the plebeians, you've got the patricians, you've got the tribunes and the consuls, and just how power is divided.
Yeah.
The Senate, all these different Roman institutions, and they eventually did break down. But Polybius didn't live to see that part. And so he lauds this greatly. Aristotle lauds this. St. Thomas Aquinas talked in De Regno on monarchy. He talks about a mixed regime being the best. Mixed meaning it. I know you know this, but incorporates elements of democracy, aristocracy, and monarchy. So I think there are ways in which our system does that that is very commendable and makes a lot of sense. Before I make the next point where I think it diverges, where it's absolutely revolutionary in a not good way, I do want to say that it's also interesting to consider, like when we say the founding, like which founding, because there's the Declaration of Independence that did not, I know you know this again, but just for the sake of the audience, that did not found, that did not start the regime we have now. It was a very, very different thing. And then the Articles of Confederation came later. These United States, not the United States, a huge difference hanging on two letters, right? And so it's always interesting to consider which founding are we talking about. I mean, even the Constitutional Convention kind of came out of nowhere, arguably illegal. That'd be a whole other discussion. But the Federalists, the founders took that argument seriously. James Madison, Hamilton, Jay, they're addressing this argument that the Constitutional Convention was acting ultra vires outside of its commission from the Continental Congress. And so anyway, I just think that's an important thing to put on the table for a future discussion. But one area where I think it is genuinely revolutionary, well, two quick ones. One, the Declaration does identify the locus of legitimate authority in the people. And while we as Catholics can and do acknowledge the importance and the validity of consent, we do not identify the locus of legitimate authority in the people. We identify it in God. And that really does affect things because, a popular phrase during the Revolution and that whole period was vox populi, vox Dei. The voice of the people is the voice of God. Who controls the people? What is beyond the boundaries of democratic choice? This, if your framework is that all legitimate authority comes from the people, there is no boundary. You've subtly, this is where I'd say the founders built worse than they knew, actually. I think they were actually horrible philosophers in many ways, horrible metaphysicians. And in some ways, they were right on the depravity of human nature. That came obviously from their Calvinism, and they got a lot right. And in that regard, please excuse the brief interruption, everyone. We just wanted to give you a quick reminder to check out the Eternal Christendom bookstore, where you can find great deals from great apostolates for both books and coffee, including the Christ the King roast that we developed with our friends at Imperium Coffee. These deals will not only save you money, but some of them provide Eternal Christendom a cut of the sale, so you'll be helping us too. Head to our homepage, eternalchristendom.com, and click Bookstore near the top right to check it out. One of the other areas I'll say, then you reflect, and then we'll go on to less controversial topics like Zionism. The other way, the way in which I think they were also genuinely revolutionary. Gosh, there's so many different ways to go with this, but I'll say one. There's probably better ones, but the founders spoke of religion in an overwhelmingly Pelagian fashion. When you actually examine the underlying theology, there's many fine statements about religion, but the way they define it, it's not sacramental at all. It has nothing to do with grace. It's all about a set of teachings that people choose to follow. And that's how Pelagius essentially defined grace. He defined it as a set of teachings, and grace is the free will God has given us. And with our free will, we assent and obey those teachings. That's essentially what Pelagius said in many ways, and in so many words. And so that is the overwhelming view of religion. All these fine quotations about religion from the founders. That's the kind of theology they have. And so I'd say that's a huge problem. And they built a regime based on this idea. I mean, the Federalist Papers, this is another huge departure from Christian civilization. I mean, James Madison says it's a good thing for there to be more sects, more religious sects, because they'll check and balance each other. So that'd be just one example of many I'd give where there's a genuine revolutionary break.
I think that there were genuinely revolutionary characters for sure in the, Madison being one of them, Jefferson being one of them. I think that you get closest to something like sincere piety in the statements of and the letters of George Washington.
Yeah.
Who seemed to have a genuine faith and who had more of a sense of real grace and the need for grace in a way that you don't get from as you were saying, where they're talking about this in a very Pelagian way. I think if I had to venture an explanation for why that is, we have to keep in mind that these guys were looking back on the religious wars of Europe in the last century. They had deep sectarian divisions. I mean, Puritans and Anglicans hated each other, and both of them hated Quakers. So they had, religiously, in terms of the practice of their religion and their theology, they sort of believed they had almost nothing in common with the opposing sects, right? A Puritan had nothing but contempt for Anglicanism. Anglicans had nothing but contempt for the Puritans and the Quakers. And so I think they were trying to come up with a language of speaking about religion that would avoid exacerbating those hatreds and those divisions, and would enable them to come together to actually declare independence from Great Britain, and to do it without immediately falling into sectarian warfare among the colonies. And so I think that was a prudential decision. It was a prudential way of talking about it that had the effect, I think, of coming off, as you say, in a very Pelagian way, where it's almost this sort of antiseptic way of talking about theology, and a very maybe not antiseptic strength, we're more of a cerebral way of talking about it that maybe didn't actually reflect the actual piety of the people of the colonies at the time, but it was an expedient for what they were trying to accomplish. But you bring up some great points, and this is something that I cannot make a definitive and conclusively compelling argument for my view of the founding, which is probably why I haven't written a book about it. But it deserves it deserves a deeper discussion. And I think the discussions that are going on right now that question some of the mythology around our founding and question some of the received narratives are good. And I think, as you said at the beginning of this section, we're both patriots. We would both die for our country. I have no home on this earth except America.
Yep. Amen.
And so I criticize her, and when I want to get to the truth of our founding, not to undermine her, but because I have love and devotion for her. So
100%. Well, to reinforce one of the points you just made, the famous letter. I mean, Jefferson responds to this letter with the quote about separation of church and state, wall of separation between church and state. He's responding to the Danbury Baptists, who themselves are writing to him. If I remember correctly, it's been a while since I've gone into this, but the Congregationalists in Connecticut who were trying to impose their own view of Protestantism, and the Baptists were basically trying to write the president and about this issue. And so to make your point about sectarianism, and this is why I think on the founding front it's a Protestant solution to a Protestant problem, and which again. We can make and should make prudential judgments, and maybe it was the best that could be done. I also think we can evaluate those prudential judgments in light of that which is objectively true. I know you agree, of course, but and one point that my friend Dr. Alan Phimister makes, and he loves America, but he said, and I think this kind of sums up the rest of my objections. He said America was the first post-Constantinian Western polity that did not acknowledge Christ as king in its organic law. Yeah. And this is a point, if people want to look up the National Reform Association, the first NRA, as it were, this was a group of Protestants, no Catholics, and they were advocating that the United States amend the Constitution to acknowledge Christ as king. I think they even included language about the Bible having a sort of special place in law and whatnot. It didn't pass, but they particularly pushed during the Civil War period, and they provided all these quotes from founders as well. I mean, John Adams, actually, Benjamin Rush wrote him one time and basically said it's a tragedy that God's not even mentioned in our Constitution. And Adams agreed. Adams bewailed the fact that the Constitution that he was for, he wanted it to go, but that it did not mention God. And so a lot of these NRA guys, they would quote presidents of Yale, presidents of Dartmouth, well-known preachers. They would quote Luther Martin. That was literally his name, one of the founders. They would quote Adams in some cases. I think Benjamin Rush. They would quote all these great Americans over the decades preceding the Civil War. And one of them made the point, they said, if our Constitution was found 1,000 years from now in the desert sands by an infidel, he would have no idea whether we were Christian, infidel, pagan, whatever. And he said, and this is a huge problem. And many of them were saying the reason why we've gotten to this point in the Civil War is because we have not acknowledged Christ as king. So I think there are other areas with regard to that taken in the broad sweep of Christian history, are worth considering further. But I'll give you the last word on this. Otherwise, we can go to Zionism. But go ahead if you have a last word.
No, I mean, I don't object to anything that you're saying, and I think that there's a lot more that could be said about this.
Yeah.
I think, one of the things that occurred to me while we were talking, a friend of mine who I went to college with, actually, who's a professor at the Franciscan University at Steubenville. He's a medieval historian, and he's also one of the founders of St. Joseph the Worker, the College of St. Joseph the Worker. A guy named Andrew Jones, Dr. Andrew Jones.
Yeah.
He runs a journal called New Polity. His first book, which I think was his PhD dissertation, is called Before Church and State.
Yep. And
it's a fascinating book about, I believe, 12th century France, and the texture of a truly Catholic society and truly Catholic regime, and how so many elements that we associate with the American political experiment were present in a very full and effective way. The checks and balances on power, the subsidiarity of government and of how decisions were made, the rights of peasants and of the very lowest echelons of society were not oppressed. They were not without recourse to the law and to a kind of judiciary to hear their claims and to give them redress for grievances against people of much higher rank. Checks on the monarchy, the division between matters that were decided by an ecclesial court and matters that were decided by the monarchical court. All of these things that we do not associate with medieval Europe, right?
Yeah.
We're there, and and I think that it's worth taking a step back and looking at where did these things come from, right? When you look at the 16th century debates about the status of natives that were discovered in the Spanish colonies, are they Bartolomé de las Casas, who argued that these are children of God, they cannot be coerced into servitude, they cannot be forcibly converted or killed with impunity. These were all things that came out of Catholic Christendom that found their way into the American founding and into the American experiment and into the sort of English civilization in America that gave rise to the American founding. So I think that's our pedigree. Whether John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were willing to acknowledge it or not, I don't really care if what Thomas Jefferson has to say about some things, because I think he was crazy when it comes to some of these questions, and no better than some kind of like left-wing Ivy League professor, right?
It's true in regard to
some
some
aspects
things.
of his
It's true.
radicalism, right?
Yeah, yeah,
I'm not interested in Thomas Jefferson's version of the Bible, for example.
yeah,
I just don't
yeah,
care what he says. And so I think those are the kinds of things that you begin to kind of try to circle this back to where we started this podcast about conversion. These are the kinds of questions that you begin to ask, I think, of our founding. Not that Catholic conversion or a Catholic faith is required for them, but it certainly helps and invites this kind of inspection of the foundations of the American regime in a way that a lot of times you just don't get when you are taking the official version of our
yeah,
country at face value.
yeah. No, well said. And in the spirit of giving you the last word, I will say nothing contrary to what you just said. But I will fully affirm with you. I do think there are many legal, institutional, cultural, philosophical, obviously theological roots in medieval Europe that most people are woefully unaware of.
Yeah.
Brian Tierney is a great scholar on this kind of stuff, who I was actually introduced to by a very feminist professor of mine in college. In my freshman year of college, I took two classes from a really great professor. I'll keep her name private. She's still alive and great lady. But history of the medieval church was one class, and another one, you would have loved this. Legal and constitutional history of medieval England, something like that. So he read all like the constitutions of Clarendon and
Right.
Gosh, it's been a long time since, but it's really fascinating to read this stuff. You're like, oh, that sounds kind of like the Declaration.
Right.
So yeah, you're right. There's these much deeper roots for things that I fully agree with you deserve examining and are part of the mix 100%. So. Now to transition to the Zionism issue, I want to see if let's see if this works. You were talking about, if we sort of have this received narrative of the United States, there's sort of like an attachment to it. And you mentioned earlier your view that evangelicals will sometimes attach themselves to Jewish things because there's at least a sense of rootedness and tradition and whatnot.
Yeah.
So I want to actually connect these two a little bit. And if you want to offer any final thoughts on it with respect to America before you go into then by all means. But I do think because Protestantism, there are Protestant sects who don't outright deny the visible church. Calvin didn't, whatnot. But there is a sense in which they at the very least they lower it from what it was before. Mm-hmm. There's many aspects and resources that the traditional view of the visible church, the visible Catholic Church, just no longer has among the Protestant sects. And I think evangelicalism in particular, let's stipulate here, low church Protestantism has become the majority of Protestantism. So I think that's why, some high church Protestants, and I understand why they object, and we want to be fair, we want to be truthful, Anglicans, high church Presbyterians, whatever. They'll say, well, that's not full, and I get that, that's not full of you, but this is the vast majority at this point. And what it's done is it's lowered radically views of the visible church. And so I do think there is a sort of latching on to the United States as a visible society that scratches that itch that we human beings have. And in a similar way, per what you said before, I've said this for years, I do think many evangelicals, because they don't know the history many times, and even if they do, they'll deny apostolic succession, they'll deny apostolic tradition, and so they glom on to many Jewish things because it satisfies that need, it scratches that itch for a visible continuity that all human beings have. We can't understand ourselves outside of our visible. You and I don't exist unless there's literally, hundreds at this point? Hundreds of generations, thousands, who knows, back to Adam and Eve. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, that's my thought as we transition to this. Any reflections on that?
Yeah, I think I've seen this, in when I was a Protestant and when I was younger, you'd see forms of this. Sometimes it takes very strange forms and strange manifestations. notions of prophecy and notions of the end times that are very clearly a search for tradition, a search for rootedness, that they just don't have in their tradition. Because I mean, one of the things that you don't have, especially certainly as a low church Protestant, is any tradition. And we were just talking about the Quakers, and I was,
or barely any, yeah.
Struck reading about the Quakers that, like, there was kind of a cult, there was, like, you had George Fox and his teachings, and then and that was the extent. I mean, he was alive, like, during, so these Quaker meetings were happening, and they were, talk about revolutionary, like they were like at the time, I can understand why Anglicans would have thought of them as like a crazy cult, like the way we might see somebody living, on a compound, like David Koresh type of a thing, as being in a cult. And so I think that the impulse to sort of reach back into the Old Testament and grab onto Jewish traditions, even if it's something as simple as like doing like a Seder dinner, or some of these other, like, what we might think of, I think wrongly, but what we would commonly think of just cultural practices, and adopting these cultural practices so that there's some sense of connection to, like, Jesus and the apostles, Well, Jesus celebrated the Passover, and so we should celebrate the Passover. And making, not quite understanding, or maybe rejecting the idea that, when Jesus celebrated the Passover, the Last Supper, he was transforming it because he was becoming the Passover. I recently read Dr. Brad Petry's book, Jesus and the Jewish Roots of the Eucharist.
Brant Petry,
wonderful,
yeah.
Petry, yes.
Brant Petry, yeah.
Brant Petry, I want to get that right, which is a beautiful little book, where he talks about, the different cups, of the Passover dinner, and that the last cup didn't happen until Christ was on the cross, and then after he took the last cup, he says it's finished. It's beautiful book, and a beautiful account. But I think there's a desire to connect to these things that they read about in the Bible, and they don't have any way of connecting to them. And I think where that leads is to some very strange places. And one of the places that it has led historically, and I think that's happening again as low church Protestantism becomes the mainstream of Protestantism, is to some strange ideas about Zionism and eschatology and the third temple, and the importance, and conflating the modern nation state of Israel with biblical Israel.
Yeah. Well, let's dive into that. And again, we'll be clear at the top. There are actually some lower church Protestants, like 1689 Reformed Baptists, whatever, tend to be very loud anti-Catholics. Many of them, James White is an example, but they would be on a number of these issues. They would be firmly of our persuasion. So I want to be clear that there are a number of Protestants out there who would very much agree with a lot of what I'm sure you're about to say and what we'll reflect on. So yeah, what was well, first of all, I mean, you peruse it in whatever direction you want to go, or you pursue it rather. But I do think definitions are really important. So, and what was your view of the state of Israel before becoming Catholic? What is it now? How do you define Zionism? Again, whatever direction you want to pursue, and then I'll just ask some follow-ups.
Yeah, I think before I became a Catholic, I like a lot of Americans, I was generally pro-Israel, but I was never a Protestant that assigned biblical significance to the nation state of Israel, and I'm glad that I didn't sort of get that from my Protestant upbringing and the churches and the instruction that I happened to receive. I don't doubt, in retrospect, that many of my fellow evangelicals and fellow members of congregations I was a part of, students at Bible school, colleagues in missionary work, did assign a biblical and prophetic significance to the 1948 state of Israel. I never did. I supported Israel to some extent still do, just on purely secular geopolitical grounds. As a democracy in a region that doesn't have very much democracy, as a friend to the United States. Recent events, not least of which is this Iran war that is, I guess, back on now as of this recording, are calling into question, I think, the extent to which Israel is really a friend to the United States and is an ally worthy of the name. But I think that because I never got was taught that in a strong way, I maybe underestimated the extent to which much of the Protestant world, and especially the evangelical world, does assign theological significance to the political Zionist, modern political Zionist project and the secular state of Israel, and think that it has a special place in God's sort of eschatological plan for the world and for the end times. And I found that when I sort of began to realize this, and still continue to find that, frankly, shocking that this could be such a mainstream view among American Protestants, and that it could be a view that is held in the upper echelons of political power in the United States. And I'm thinking of people like Senator Ted Cruz and Senator Lindsey Graham and others, and not just office holders, but the people who help fund those campaigns and who support those people in office. That it really is a mainstream view. And to your point about definitions, I think the escape hatch that in this discourse that you see all the time is, oh, well, Zionism just means Israel has a right to exist. Are you saying that you don't think Israel has a right to exist? And I think that's completely disingenuous way to debate this issue, because I'm sorry, but when we're talking about Protestant America, and especially low church Protestant mainstream, the vast majority of those people do not define Zionism simply as Israel's right to exist. Yeah. They might say, yes, Zionism, part of what it means is Israel's right to exist, but it also has this theological significance. It has this eschatological role to play in God's plan for His creation, and that's why you see a lot of support for what I think are really strange things, like the third temple and the red heifer and the return of animal sacrifices. And you see this, I'm sorry, but you see this among low church Protestants, and it has to be part of the discussion. We cannot have the discussion be cut off, sort of at the knees by saying, no, you have to, Zionism is just Israel's right to exist, and if you deny that, then you're basically an pro-Hamas Antifa rioter. And I feel like that a lot of times that's as far as, and you're you're Nick Fuentes anti-Semite.
Yeah.
And I feel like a lot of times that's as far as the conversation gets, without actually getting into, well, what are your theological beliefs about Israel? Yeah, right. What do you actually believe about Israel? And when you see things like, and to his credit, my friend Tucker Carlson has done good work in getting people like Mike Huckabee and Ted Cruz to actually just say the thing. I can't. The interview he did with Mike Huckabee was shocking in what Huckabee was just willing to say. He
outright endorsed the Greater Israel Project, at least virtually.
It's
utterly strange.
It was scandalous, and the fact that it didn't provoke denunciations and distancing from evangelicals and evangelical writers and thinkers and leaders, to me suggests that his views on Israel are maybe more mainstream than a lot of people would like to believe.
Wow, there's not much on the table you've put there, John. Okay, where to begin? Like, that joke about a mosquito at a nudist colony. I don't know where to begin. Because I agree with basically everything you said, but I think there's so much more to dig into. Let's see, where do we start? So I have actually, I I don't like to use the term Zionism to explain my beliefs anymore, either what I'm for or against, because you're right. Some people will claim, and by some people I mean like, Jews themselves and the Israeli prime minister and whatnot. They'll claim it's just the right to exist. It's just this aspiration of the Jewish people to a homeland, a national homeland in the Holy Land, their ancestral homeland, whatnot. And if that's all it was, there's still some theological things I'd want to sort through with that. But then this same prime minister will quote Amos at the UN, talking about the redoing of the vineyards and whatnot, and they will not be plucked up from their land again, or Isaiah or whatever. And they'll claim this is now. This is us now. And that's what happens with many people who self-proclaim to be Zionists. The other reason is purely practical. I don't need an ism to declare that I believe a certain state has a right to exist. I don't even have an ism for my own belief about our own country having a right to exist. I say, I'm a patriot. America came into existence. It has a right to exist. And, in law, I went to law school. I'm sorry. I'll try to be not very annoying about it. But there's a concept called prescription and adverse possession that if something comes into existence and if somebody plops on a piece of land in many jurisdictions and they use the land as if it's theirs, and the proper owner of the land doesn't act contrary to that and never tries to remove, there are statutes that allow people after a certain passage of time to actually obtain title to that land. It's called adverse possession. So there are ways in which somebody doesn't necessarily have to support, like maybe somebody wouldn't have supported the revolution for America, but after it's won, after the treaty's signed, it's like, okay, yeah, this is a legitimate country now. And that happens. I'm not an international law expert. I'm not a natural law expert, so I don't claim to know all the ins and outs of that. But that happens. So I don't have an ism for that with any country. So I don't need it for the state of Israel. That's kind of my point. It's like, why am I always expected to have a special ism just for Israel? It's like, I don't need that. That'd be one. Yeah, it sounds like you've got some thoughts. Go ahead.
No, I agree with you. I'm so frustrated with the does Israel have a right to exist discourse, because it's hard to know, like, well, what do you mean by that? Does Lebanon have a right to exist? Does
Iran have a right to exist?
Does Iran have a right to exist? What are
dangerous questions?
Because I feel like people, when they say that, they mean something that they're not saying, and that for whatever reason they don't want to say, or they don't want to say fully, but it feels like a disingenuous talking point, and a way to cabin the conversation, when what we're not really talking about whether or not Israel has a right to exist. When it comes to this question of Protestant Zionism, we're talking about what is the significance of Israel existing?
Yes.
What does that mean for us? And I think in theological terms, if you don't have the Catholic faith, if you don't understand that Christ is the temple, and that the Catholic Church is the new Israel, or is the fulfillment of the old covenant, right?
And Vatican II calls it the new Israel, just to be clear.
It's all one. It's one religion. It's not two separate religions. If anything, rabbinical Judaism is a separate religion that arose in opposition to Christianity. And so I think if you don't have that Catholic understanding of the continuity of the Old and New Testament, then it is understandable that you will want to reach back to the Old Testament for some kind of authentic religion, and that what you will end up doing, maybe unwittingly, is endorsing theologically a kind of a form of paganism, a form of paganism that has sort of like Jewish trappings. I'm sorry, but bringing back animal sacrifice, and these red heifer operations in Israel, which I went to one in January of this year.
Yes.
Are not just projects that are being pushed and led by religious Jews in Israel. The red heifers themselves at the place that I went to were provided by a Protestant Texas rancher who had a breed of red heifer that is, I guess, is ideal for these purposes. And so it's a collaboration between between religious Jews on the one hand, who have their own reasons for wanting a third temple, and various Protestant sects that have a different set of reasons for wanting the third temple and for wanting to bring back animal sacrifice. But in either case, I think if at this point, if you bring back animal sacrifice, you are instituting a form of paganism. What you're doing, whatever it is not Christianity, and it's also not Old Testament Judaism, which has been fulfilled in the Catholic faith.
Yeah. So well said. I'm having chills with some of what you're saying because it's very powerful, and I want to emphasize a few of the points before we move on, because I do want people to know about this trip you had. I've had a number of trips to Israel, and I want to say just very, very briefly, I have Jewish friends in Israel. I have Palestinian friends in Israel. Like, I've got a black friend. I'm not trying to do that. It's like I have people who I genuinely love over there. So when I hear, Jewish friends who tell me they pray for me, Palestinian friends who call me Habibi. I've been to a lot of the Palestinian areas. I've actually met with leaders from Fatah and Hamas. I didn't realize they were Hamas before I went in, just to be clear. but I get to the threshold. This is a meeting in 2014. I asked actually the man who's now the mayor of Bethlehem. I asked him to connect me with some Palestinian leaders. That was all. And I said, Fatah, whatever. I figured we're in the West Bank. We're not in Gaza, so there's no Hamas. Little did I know. So literally right before we're about to go to the meeting, I got some Hamas guys too. I'm like, what? I was scared out of my mind because I knew. And he's like, no, it's fine. It's fine. And we had a 4-hour discussion. I prayed with them in the name of Jesus, and they hugged me afterward. And I heard that half of the room was arrested the next day by the Shin Bet or something like that. So anyway, I've had a fascinating set of experiences. I've seen the state of Israel lied about. I've seen the state of Israel lie. I've seen Palestinians get abused, and I've seen cases where the state of Israel and Jews who are in the West Bank go way overboard to try and make sure they're respected. I know Palestinians who have suffered horribly at the hands of the IDF. I know Palestinians who have suffered horribly at the hands of the IDF. They've also suffered horribly at the hands of their own people. So I won't. I'm sure you have similar. Like, I am not in the relatively brief amount of time we have on this. I do not have the time or the bandwidth to explain the full spectrum of my beliefs on this, because I've been, as we get into this very interesting time period we're in. Excuse me. I feel very, very blessed to have these sorts of experiences that I've had. It's a very rare set of experiences. So, but to really emphasize the point you made, let's take even the Catholic stuff out of it. Obviously, the Catholic faith is the Christian faith, but let's just remove the Catholic label so we're not scaring off Protestants really quick. If you believe that Jesus Christ is the Messiah, that means the religion of the Old Testament of Moses was a preparation to be fulfilled by him. So when we say New Israel, this is one of the tropes I just hate. I hate the term supersessionism and replacement theology, because they've been so abused, they're so ambiguous, they're rarely defined. They'll say, well, there's no place for the Jewish people. It's like, there is in the New Israel. The New Israel consists of Jews and Christians. There is a place for Jews. We don't believe it totally replaced Jews. How can we believe it totally replaced Jews? We have the apostles. We have Our Lady. Mm-hmm. We have our Lord, for goodness sakes. We've had many Jewish converts over the millennia. Obviously not the fullness of the people, but when Jesus is describing the wedding feast and the invite goes first to the Jewish people, his own family, his people according to the flesh. And by the way, we're waiting for him. Like, we, as Catholics, the fathers are unanimous. The Jews will have an end times conversion. We're waiting for that. Come to the party. We want you. We're not saying we replace. No, you were first invited to this party. Yep. You were first invited to this feast. The first pope was one of you. Our Lady, our mother, is one of you. Our apostles are ones of you. No, we didn't supersede Jews as Jews. We superseded the Old Testament religion because it's been fulfilled. And the Old Testament religion says, follow the prophet, the new prophet who will come. It's the Messiah. Jews interpret it as Messiah as well. So if Jesus is that Messiah, that means Moses himself virtually obligates
Yes.
you to follow Christ. That is
Yes.
why you cannot claim, well, this is Moses. Like, no, objectively, let's get out of the realm of opinion. Objectively, if Jesus is the Messiah, Moses requires you to follow him, which is why my friend Scott Hahn was on an interview with another friend, Gavin Ashenden, who used to be the chaplain to the Queen. I'm sure you know that.
Gavin's a friend of mine.
Yeah. We've got a lot of mutual friends. Both of them are on our advisory board. And Scott Hahn said, this is why those who insist on being in the old covenant are in a burning house. Not because that covenant wasn't good, but because it was preparatory. As Paul talks about, it was a tutor to receive Christ. So I think these are just some things to really, you made these points, and they were excellent points, like cathartic points. People really need to understand this, that we are not rejecting the Jewish roots of our faith. We're saying, no, they have become more real. I don't know about you, but since becoming Catholic, I see more Jewish things all over the place. The Jews haven't had an altar for 2,000 years. We have.
Yep.
The Jews haven't had a temple for 2,000 years. We do. The Jews haven't had a sacrifice for 2,000 years. We do. The Jews haven't had a priesthood for 2,000 years. We do. So anyway, I'm getting a little too worked up, but you go ahead.
You're absolutely right. There is a continuity between the Old Testament and the New Testament that only exists in the framework of the Catholic Church. The idea, and I think a lot of Protestants don't fully understand this because they don't fully understand what the sacrifice of the Mass is, that Protestants can offer praise, but they can't offer worship because true worship is the sacrifice of the Mass that Christ instituted. He told us how we were to worship him. And the way he told us we were to worship him has its roots, was prefigured in the Passover. It was prefigured in the manna from heaven. It was prefigured in the Day of Atonement, right? That's how we are supposed. That is true worship, and true worship finds its fulfillment. The worship of the Old Testament finds its fulfillment in the Eucharist, in the sacrifice of the Mass. And so, I actually mentioned this. Maybe I was foolish to do so to my group that I was in Israel with. I was the only Catholic. I mentioned
earlier this year, right?
Earlier this year that the Catholic Church has continuity with the Old Testament in the way that Protestantism doesn't, and then the room erupted fighting, not just with me but with one another.
Sure.
And I was surprised because I thought that I was saying something that was obvious and that was unobjectionable, right? And really was just what you had just said. The Jews no longer have priests, the Catholic Church does. They no longer have an altar, the Catholic Church does. They no longer make sacrifice, the Catholic Church does. And so, one of the things I think, and I hate terms like supersessionism and even Zionism too, because again, I think those are used as a shortcut and a way to cabin the debate. And they're not used to shed any light.
They could have been useful, but they no longer are. They could have been useful, but they no longer are, because they were used so ambiguously and vaguely from the very beginning.
Right. I think part of the disconnect here, when you're talking about Zionism with Protestants, is I think there's a lack of understanding in many cases, not in all, but in many cases, of Protestants not understanding what it is that Catholics believe about the Mass and about the Eucharist, about what it is, right? And to be fair, there's a lot of Catholics that are confused on this point too.
Sure.
And which is a big problem. And so because they have an incomplete understanding of what it is that Catholics believe about the sacrifice of the Mass and about the Eucharist, they don't understand everything that you just said about how the Mass connects to the temple of the Old Testament, how it connects to the Passover, and how it connects to these things that they themselves are looking back to as sources of tradition, and maybe just there's not an understanding that these things are present in the Catholic liturgy. They are present in the Catholic Mass, and that's how we understand it, and that's
fulfilled
what
and transfigured.
True. Exactly. And I think that there is there's a huge disconnect in the conversation about that, and I think also, to the extent that there is an understanding that that's what Catholics claim, there's a reluctance to really engage with it because of the implications. Because the implications of it, of course, are huge, not just for Protestantism, but for what their understanding of Judaism is. Rabbinical Judaism is, and
Yes.
the follow-on effects of that, what their understanding of what Israel, the modern nation state of Israel, is, and what it is not.
Yeah, no, it's very, very well said. So this is so in the oath that I still have it here on another tab. In the oath I took coming into the church, there was a line in there, John. I know you've heard me talk about it before, but here's the line. I admit the sacred scriptures in the sense which has been held and is still held by Holy Mother Church, whose duty it is to judge the true sense and interpretation of sacred scripture, and I shall never accept or interpret them except according to the unanimous consent of the fathers. And as it turns out, this was taught directly by Session 4 of the Council of Trent. It's been reaffirmed by Vatican I. So this is a dogmatic teaching of and the Creed of Pius IV. This is a dogmatic teaching of the Catholic Church that when the fathers are unanimous, they're not unanimous on everything, but there are quite actually a few things that they are unanimous on. And it's generally been deemed to be a moral unanimity, not necessarily a mathematical unity. But John, there are some things on which the fathers are, of those who raise certain topics, mathematically unanimous. And there's two of them related to the times we're in, potentially, that I think are very interesting. One of them is that Antichrist will bring the public sacrifice of the Mass. Actually, we'll do three. First one is Antichrist will bring the public sacrifice of the Mass to an end, which was very interesting because as an evangelical, I didn't know that. And so when I read Daniel's prophecy about the daily burnt offering being brought to an end by Antichrist, we took that as, maybe this was the case for you, Antichrist will bring the reinstituted sacrifices of a third temple to an end. Now, of course, as a Catholic, there's a sense in which I could say, well, yeah, that's kind of true. He'll bring the sacrifice of the actual third temple, the Catholic Church, to an end. But right. I didn't have that framework as an evangelical. Right. So when I saw all the fathers describing the Mass as a sacrifice, I was like, oh my gosh. And all of them interpreted Daniel this way, that Daniel would bring Catholic worship to an end for 3.5 years. Like, oh my goodness. So anyway, that has implications for COVID. We don't have to get into that now, but it's essentially why I concluded COVID was an apocalyptic event. Second thing is that they are unanimous. I'm writing a book on this right now. Won't say the publisher because I think they want to do it, but we'll see if they're brave enough. But that the Jews will initially receive Antichrist as a false Messiah. This is an established fact in Catholic theology. It cannot be ignored. And certainly part of Jewish messianic expectations are a rebuilding of the temple. There's some variances in Jewish tradition. I think the Rashi tradition was that it would be built in heaven and descend in some way. The Rambam or Maimonides tradition, which became the more authoritative one, is like, no, it'll be rebuilt in Jerusalem. So they're absolutely expecting that. So if you're going to expect that, then yeah, it makes sense that you would receive a man who would. This is a majority tradition. The fathers, not unanimous, that Antichrist will likely rebuild, or at least attempt to rebuild, a third temple, as it were, in Jerusalem. And then the third one is that the Jews will convert. They'll come to Christ. And there's various Old Testament passages and New Testament passages that allude to this. So these are three things on which the fathers are unanimous. And so this is where I actually think there is tons of Catholic room. I think I know what many Catholics mean when they say this, and so I don't take this as a pushback, but just to further refine what you said earlier about saying eschatological significance in the state of Israel. Who knows what will happen? I don't know the timeline. But my point is I do think there is plenty of Catholic room to see in the ingathering of the Jewish people to the Holy Land a preparation for that time of Antichrist and a preparation for their conversion. I think where the key difference is I, as a Catholic, I'd say we absolutely not only shouldn't, but cannot believe that Christ-rejecting Jews have a divine right to possess the Holy Land. I think they are there by God's grace and mercy. I think it's actually a mass catechetical exercise for the Jewish people to understand God's grace and mercy for when they ultimately receive it in Christ. That's what I think. That's my personal opinion about what's going on. But that does not mean that the Jews have a divine right based on Abraham or Moses, since, John, you and I are children of Abraham, according to St. Paul, if we are in Christ, right? So unless you want to say that we too have a divine right to the land, which nobody's going to say. So that's where I think the rub is does somebody believe that the Jews, with all the sympathy in the world for what they've endured through history, absolutely. Nobody can hate them. Nobody can despise them. We pray for their conversion, all that stuff. But I do not believe they are divinely entitled to receive this land. And that's frankly how many people talk. Yeah. They will act as if the Bible is a title deed. Yeah. Go ahead.
No, you're right. I mean, look, Theodor Herzl didn't even believe that.
The founder of Zionism, modern
Zionism. Of Zionism, they were looking at land in Uganda, right? At one point, the idea wasn't that they had this divine mission to actually go back to Jerusalem, but to have a Jewish homeland, right? No, I think that you can make a case that I don't like to get into this too deeply because I don't like the who was here first arguments when it comes to like who has a right to what land, right? Because I think those don't really go anywhere. But if you were going to say, if you were going to try to identify in the year 2026 who the indigenous inhabitants of the Holy Land are, I think you would have to say that it's the Palestinian Christians who live there. They are the descendants of the Jews who converted to Christianity and who remained in those communities in an unbroken line since the time of Christ. Those are the original inhabitants, right, of the Holy Land. The Zionist movement of the 19th century that brought Jews from Europe and from Russia and from different parts of the world to the Holy Land, and established communities where they were established. They were not indigenous to that area in the same way that the Palestinian Christian, both Orthodox and Catholic, that had been there in unbroken succession since the time of the apostles had been there. So, and that's not an argument to say that, the Palestinians are the rightful heirs, that's not an argument for Palestinian statehood, whatever that means. That's simply to say that, referencing what I said earlier, I think it is a category error, both to say that the modern nation state of Israel is somehow has a connection to biblical Israel, or that it is the same thing that Scripture is talking about the Zionist project of the 19th and 20th centuries, and it's a mistake to say that even the land promises are talking about. I mean, when you look at the land promises to Abraham, they're talking about in many passages a heavenly Jerusalem, a heavenly land, that the ultimate inheritance of the children of Abraham is the heavenly city. It's not a physical place. It's not a spot in Judea. It's not a spot in greater Mesopotamia or the land between the Euphrates and the Nile. There's a strong biblical scriptural case to be made that the promise of the inheritance of the children of Israel is the heavenly Jerusalem. And as Catholics, we understand that to be that the promise. The promise is given to Israel is the promise that we have inherited and that we hold as Catholics, that there will be a new heaven and a new earth, and that we'll be together with Christ and all the saints and the angels in this paradise. So I think that there's you maybe who knows what the role of the Jews will be, but I think between everything I just said and what I said earlier, that I think there's a strong case to be made that rabbinical Judaism is a different religion than Second Temple Judaism, let's call it.
100%. 100%.
And so if it is a different religion, I'm not sure what role this rabbinical Judaism, this sort of new religion that dates from sort of late antiquity, the early medieval times, has to play at all in God's plan for the world and for the end times?
Well, if it's related to the reception of Antichrist as a false Messiah, perhaps that. I mean, just to be frank. And it's very interesting because I know a lot of Orthodox Jews, and we agree on a lot. We agree on tons of moral matters. They're
Right.
in their moral family lives. They're some of the best people I know, right? Not all of them.
Deep,
there's schmucks among, yeah. Well, there's schmucks among Jews just as there's schmucks among Catholics, so.
And I will say, I was deeply impressed by the lives of the Orthodox Jewish people, the religious Jewish people that I met and interacted with when I was in Israel, that they have got a lot right. And
yes.
We in America would do well to emulate them in their family lives, in their moral lives, in the way that they order their communities. There's a lot to admire there, and I don't want to make it seem like I'm sort of like against their whole way of living.
Yeah, sure.
What we're talking
about Catholics, if I could just say this really quick, we Catholics need to take Sunday as seriously as they take their Shabbat. Because I've been in Israel when they have Shabbat. The whole country, at least large portions of it, a lot of Tel Aviv still keeps going because it's a much more secular place. But it shuts down. People are with their families. They're with their friends. And, when you're in Israel, you participate in that. I wasn't participating in it as a religious thing, but simply as a lot of secular Jews do this, right? It's a cultural thing. And we can't do that religiously because that's been fulfilled and whatnot. But I had some of the best conversations I've ever had around a 6 or 7 hour meal on a Friday evening in the state of Israel. Many of them Christians, Messianic Jews, and that's just what they do. But you're right. We need to take that serious. So I have a quick anecdote on this that I want you to tell the story about your trip there. And you can mention names or whoever if you'd like, but I'll leave that entirely up to your prudential judgment. But when I went to for the first time to the state of Israel in 2013 as an evangelical with a Zionist group, the leader of the group, dear friend of mine to this day, love him to death. So I go and I'm very, very curious. It hadn't fully exploded yet, but I was having a growing religious crisis. Like, how do we know it's true, right? What I said earlier, Bible's God's word, truth is real for everybody, but we're all disagreeing on it. So it was just, there were still tensions with that. So I was learning so much about the Orthodox Jewish faith that was not, because I'd always been told in the Protestant polemics, well, Paul was speaking against this sort of Phariseeism. And there's elements of that are true. But what I was learning from these Orthodox Jews in the state of Israel was quite different. So I actually think they laid the seed in my mind of like, maybe not everything I've been told in my Protestant background is true. So, but I asked each one, okay, I know this is going to be a tough one. And I kind of laughed as I said it because I was like, they're not going to really want to entertain this, but pretend Jesus was Messiah, in their framework, of course. What denomination or church do you think would likely be his? Every single one said the Catholic Church. Every single one. And that really, certain words I don't want to use on a podcast, but it really bothered me. and so I have often said that the Jews, as the typology in the Fathers, there's so much amazing typology. A lot of these books behind me that where the Fathers are analyzing the Old Testament in light of Christ, it's like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. But the Jews kind of set the stage for me to become Catholic. Because I remember that put a huge, it's like, wow, if these people are reading the Old Testament as best they can, and even they can recognize that, if Jesus was Messiah, it makes sense that the Catholic Church would be his church. It's like, that was very interesting. So anyway, that's my anecdote.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I'm not surprised to hear it. I got to feeling that I didn't have that. Next time I go back, I'm going to ask the Jews I interact with that question because that's a good idea. I didn't have that exact kind of conversation. I've no qualms in sharing that I was there with the conservative study group that was sponsored by the Herzl Institute, which is an outfit that Yoram Hazony helps to head up, and I was asked to join the group. It was about a dozen of us. I was the only Catholic, which I found out was somewhat rare. There's usually more Catholics involved, so this is heavily Protestant trip, and I haven't spent that much concentrated time around Protestants in a long time, simply because it was a very intense, week all going all over Israel. You know, we would start at 7:30 in the morning, and we'd get back to the hotel at 10 or 11 at night. There were long days. And it was partly because it's a great program, and I'm very thankful to Yoram and everybody at the Herzl Institute. They put on it's a really great program, and they're doing very good work. But they're trying to the days were long because they're trying to combine like a Holy Land tour with like a graduate seminar on like Israeli politics and policy. So they're trying to do two things at once, and so we would have these sort of comical moments where you pull up in the bus to the Mount of Beatitudes and be like, all right, this is the Mount of Beatitudes. You got 10 minutes and meet back at the bus. So it's like not even time for a rosary.
Yeah.
There were, to borrow a phrase from William F. Buckley, was kind of like racing through paradise. Every single thing that we did, I was like, well, we could spend, I could at least spend the day here, but nope, it's just 10, 20 minutes and we got to move on. So it was a very full week, and we went to, we went all over. We went to down to the border with Gaza, to the Gaza Strip. We went up to the Golan Heights. We went to Tel Aviv.
Well, really quick, the Gaza thing, because this is post October 7th. This was early 2026. What was that like going to the border? Because I've been at the border several times, but it was before October 7th. So what was that like?
It was pretty shocking. We went to a police station that was right next to the border. That was one of the first places that got hit very hard. I'm blanking on the name of it now. And there's a memorial there. A couple dozen police officers and members of that community got into kind of a pitched battle. That some Hamas terrorists took over the police station, and there was like this extended battle for the police station there. And in the end, I think they killed all the terrorists and hit the police station with a tank artillery or something.
Sure.
Very powerful, though. It's a memorial. And then we went to the site of the music festival, which was the site of hundreds of people were slaughtered there. It was really a terrible, and that was a very heavy day, because it was a beautiful sunny day, and there were hundreds of families there going around to all of the different grave markers and praying. And we heard from this amazing guy who is just this Jewish farmer, sort of a working class guy who single-handedly saved something like 75 or 100 people. He kept going back. He just stumbled upon it, and he kept going back and pulling kids out of there. And he's a really remarkable guy. And so he spoke to our group at the site there. And then we went and we had a cookout with a bunch of Israeli soldiers who had just come back from a patrol in Gaza and got to visit with them. And so it was a very up close, short of going into Gaza, it was a very up close view, but it was entirely from the Israeli perspective, and so a lot, everything that we did on this trip was from the Israeli perspective. And they did try to bring in some Christian perspective, but it was sort of like Israeli Christians, Christians who had no complaints with being under Israeli government and Israeli rule. The one glimpse that we got is when we went to Bethlehem. We had a Christian Arab Palestinian tour guide, because our Jewish tour guide wasn't allowed to go in. Yeah, and he gave a slightly different perspective on kind of the. I know it's a buzzword, but sort of the two-tier system that you have there, and talked about how he's really subjected to a level of scrutiny that his Jewish citizens are not, that the opportunities and the restrictions that are placed upon him and his family members, and these are, he's I forget which kind of Orthodox Christian he is, maybe Syriac Orthodox. Okay. That is just a reality that there's sort of like I I guess you would call it a low level apartheid, de facto apartheid kind
Yeah.
of governance. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily wrong for Israel to do that. It's just a fact of, every inch of this, and you know this better than I do, every inch of the Holy Land is contested, every inch.
Yeah.
Between the Christians and the Muslims and the Jews, and then among the Christians, in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, there's a section of the Syrian Orthodox chapel that was like burned out like 80 years ago. There was a fire, and like they haven't been able to rebuild it because nobody can agree on what should happen. And so it's just kind of frozen in time there. But I will say that it was a very eye-opening experience for me, mostly on these questions that we've been talking about how religious Jews see their political project, and the ascendancy that religious Jews have in Israeli society right now. It was not always the case. Israel, the founding fathers of the state of Israel in the 1940s and the 1950s, these were not like super religious Jews. Like they were secular. They were secular Jewish people.
Some of them are atheists.
Some of them were atheists, and I think that a lot of the views that are increasingly mainstream among Israelis are things that they would have totally rejected. There was one point a couple days in, our tour guide, who was a religious Jew, a wonderful guy, very knowledgeable, very sincere, very warm man, who I have a lot of respect for, made a passing reference to the Third Temple and said, which is of course what we're all looking forward to. And that really grabbed me. That was the first mention of it. The visit to the Red Heifer operation would be later in the week. That really grabbed me, and I began to pay more attention. I began to ask more questions at that point, and realizing that among really serious practicing religious Jews, whether the ultra Orthodox or because not all, we don't have to get into it, but not all religious Jews like the term ultra Orthodox, because you got the fur hat Jews, and then you have the non-fur hat Jews, and there's different,
the Haredi, I think they're called.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
But looking forward to the Third Temple and working toward a political and societal project of building the Third Temple is a mainstream view among religious Jews in Israel. And I didn't fully realize that when I was there. And so it sort of changes one's understanding of what is going on in Israel, and how much we should support that as Catholics and even as Americans. I'm not sure that the American interest in that is really all that significant.
Well, yeah. Well, where do I go from there? You had made a pretty striking comment earlier that if somebody had reinstituted the seemingly Mosaic sacrifices in a so-called Third Temple in Jerusalem, you said it would be a form of paganism, which I thought was a striking statement. And I there's a sense in which I agree with that. I want to put some framing on that, and you can comment on it if you think it's helpful or not. But I think one way to think about this is, who is your high priest? And if you want to see if there is connection to the Old Testament religion, then you need a Levitical priest. But then one has to say, okay, well then what happened to the Levitical priesthood? The Levitical priesthood did have a high priest, right? Mm-hmm. Did that high priest continue to exist after Jesus Christ? No, because he is the new high priest, and he fulfills in the tabernacle above everything that the tabernacle below was meant to be just a reflection of and point heavenward. So we have a high priest, and so that's why what your statement is, whether one wants to call it paganism or not, it literally cannot be ontologically the religion of Moses. Right. Because there is no more Levitical high priest, and there never will be again. Ever.
Right. And so, if people are uncomfortable calling it a new form of paganism, I get that. But whatever it is, It's not the religion of the Old Testament. And as you say, it can't be. So it's something. It's going to be something different. It's going to be something new. It's not Second Temple Judaism. It's not the religion of Moses, and it certainly doesn't have anything to do with Christianity and the Christian faith. And so I'm frankly disturbed at the realization, and was disturbed at the realization that it is such a going concern to get this done, and that there's such money and effort and institutional effort behind this push for a reestablishment of the Third Temple and the reinstitution of animal sacrifices in Jerusalem.
Well, and Christians need to ponder, like, we believe that the Son of God is the Lamb of God, and he has offered his precious body, his precious blood for the whole world. So if you're going to say that animal sacrifices should be reinstituted and offered to God, what you are implicitly saying, not put opinion away, because religion is not a matter of opinion. God has revealed or he has not revealed. In this case, he has revealed. What you are saying is that this blood of beasts is more pleasing to God than the blood of Jesus Christ. That is what you're saying, whether you believe it explicitly in your mind or not. That gets to the diabolical root of this difference. And one can acknowledge that while saying we have a lot of agreement. We agree on much of the moral law. We agree that the Old Testament is divine revelation. We agree that God called the Jewish people to be a beacon of light to the whole world, that Messiah would come through them, whatever. But if you get Jesus Christ wrong, guess what will happen? You will fall for Antichrist, which is what all the fathers who talked about this said would happen. It's what St. Thomas Aquinas said would be a fitting punishment because there was a rejection of Christ. That is where this is headed, frankly. And I don't know the timeline. That's not my point. But the point is, as you said, there's never been more political, financial, military capacity put behind. I mean, this would have been unthinkable to the church fathers, the saints. It would have been utterly unthinkable that any Christian could even mildly support this, mildly.
Yeah, and I
or tacitly go along with it. I'll add that. Sorry to interrupt, but even tacitly go along with it.
Right, because the other thing you're doing, if you accept any form of animal sacrifice as legitimate, you're saying that the sacrifice of the cross and the blood of Christ is insufficient, and inadequate for the purposes of salvation, for the purposes of overcoming sin and death. I'm reminded on this question of Zionism and tacit or explicit support for it of the account of when Theodor Herzl visited the Vatican. This was I think in the 1890s. This is prior,
early 1900s. Pius X.
Yeah, that's right.
No,
that's right.
What was it? Theodor Herzl? Yeah, I think it was Pius X. It would have been early 1900s. Yeah.
And he was asking for Pope Pius X to support the Zionist project, and the Pope's response was, "We cannot support this. We cannot support this even." And this is Theodor Herzl's like secular Zionism. This wasn't Third Temple, red heifer Zionism. And he essentially, I don't have the quote off the top of my head, but he essentially says, if you take Jews to the Holy Land, we will be there waiting with priests to baptize you and convert you to the Catholic faith. I think people like us will be accused of anti-Semitism for saying it, but I think that Pope Pius X was right. That has to be the view of Catholics toward any kind of Zionist project and toward religious Jews, that our hope for them is that they are baptized into the Catholic faith and receive the sacraments and become Catholics. That will be the fulfillment of their Jewish religion, and it will be a source of salvation and grace for them. I guess if that makes me anti-Semitic, then I'll just accept the label.
So be it.
I
No,
don't
so
think
be
that
at this
that's
point, that's where I
anti-Semitic.
am, John. So be
Yeah.
it. You know, like what
Right.
else are we to say? I mean, I won't reveal private conversations, but I have had private I've never talked about this publicly. I have had private conversations. I've told you about it in private. I'm not going to say names in public. I've had private conversations with very influential Jews who essentially accused me of anti-Semitism for quoting Paul. For
Right.
quoting Paul. Like that's not every Jew. Of course not. There are some Jews who would find that ridiculous, just like I do. But there are very powerful people in this world, very influential people, who think quoting St. Paul is or St. John, God forbid, is anti-Semitic, which is another way of saying they think Christianity itself is anti-Semitic. We need to be clear about this. It's not every Jew. It's not every Israeli. I'm not saying that, but there absolutely is that strain in here. And of course, we need to be as charitable as possible. We need to show kindness. We need to pray for them. But this is the reality. And I think people are seeing that a bit more. And it is nerve-wracking because, John, my friend Jason Jones, maybe you know Jason, he's a convert as well, does a lot of great work in the Holy Land. He told me when I was converting, because I would have considered myself a Zionist. And just to be clear, I think we're on the same page, but just to be clear, when we're using that term for now, again, I don't like using that term, but just to the extent it's used in this interview for colloquial or useful purposes, it means a divine right to the land. That seems to be, okay. It's not, because I believe the state of Israel has a right under natural law and international law to exist. I think that's the Catholic position, so yeah, like the United States, like China, like Russia, like Iran, God forbid, like France, so that's natural law. Okay. I just have a big difference in theological assessment of it and where it's headed. But Jason told me, he's like, your Zionism, when you become Catholic, your Zionism, meaning understood in this way, will die. I'm like, I don't think so. I don't know. He's like, no, it will. And he was right. He was right. And I think this goes back to an earlier comment you made, that I do think with the lessening of the sense of the visible church, this conception of the church as a visible society that is contiguous with the apostolic band established by Christ himself in the first century, there is this desire to, because we're human, we're incarnate, right? We're invisible and visible. Our soul's invisible, our body's visible. We're a combination of the two. Christ is as well. So we have this longing to be connected to something visible and physical and tangible in our bodies. And so I think a lot of evangelicals, that scratches itch because it can't be Catholic, right? It can't be Catholic because that's. But what else can it be? Right. It's got to be the Jews. It's got to be rabbinic type stuff. And I realized when I was reading the Fathers, like, oh my gosh, there are many evangelicals who would put more stock in what a rabbi who rejects Christ says the meaning of the Bible is than a Catholic priest or St. Augustine or St. Thomas Aquinas. And that was it's cathartic even as I mention it again, because it shows you how to put it. We have so much in common that we can start from. We need to talk about that. But it shows you how seemingly a small divergence at the beginning of something can become this massive chasm the further it goes along. Right. And the depth of the deception that's involved here. So
no, you're absolutely right that once you extrapolate out the ramifications and you sort of take these things to their logical ends, there is a great divide, and there is there's maybe less common ground than we like to think, and that is why I think, to your point just a second ago, you said that it's a lot of religious Jews that believe Catholicism itself, in the fullness of the Catholic faith, is inherently anti-Semitic. I think that's right, and it's frustrating in the current kind of discourse, right, about all this, that there's this narrative that it's the Catholics who kind of have this problem, like the Jewish kind of line on that is what is kind of being adopted and being parroted, even on like non-religious podcasts and media platforms. It's just like, Catholics have a problem with Jews. It's actually the opposite. It's not Catholics don't have a problem with Jews. Jews have a problem with what the claims of the Catholic Church are, because it directly contradicts what their claims are about Judaism and about their the religious and theological significance of the state of Israel, the city of Jerusalem, the third temple, and all these things that we've been talking about. But you know what? Like, we're not going to change what our faith says about what the sacrifice of the Mass is, and what the church is, and what the temple is. We can't change any of that. That it is what it is. It's the truth of the Catholic faith. And so, again, you know, if that makes me anti-Semitic, then I guess I'll just have to be anti-Semitic. But I don't think that is anti-Semitic in the sense of that because I believe that, because I'm a faithful Catholic, I hate the Jews. I love the Jews. I want them to come into the Catholic faith like I want all my Protestant brothers and sisters to come into the Catholic faith and receive the fullness of the sacraments and receive the fullness of what Christ has for us all.
Amen. Yeah, no, and this is where I say the actual replacement theology, the actual supersessionism is rabbinic Judaism, just to be blunt.
Right.
Because again, it all hinges on Jesus Christ. If Jesus Christ is not the Messiah, he's a fraud, then the Catholic faith is supersessionist and replacement theology and all the ridiculous senses that is often thrown around. And there are Catholics who do horrible things. Whatever. We're not with them, right? Anybody who hates Jews, no. But if Jesus is the Messiah, then the religion that rejects that is actually the one that is actually replacing the religion of Moses. It is claiming to supersede the religion of Moses in a way that they accuse us of. So it really does hinge upon Jesus Christ and what we say about Jesus Christ. I was just interviewed for this UAP alien documentary, right? Not to get into that topic, but you know, it was from a Catholic documentary filmmaker. Seemed like a nice guy, thoughtful guy. And he was way more open to the possibilities of this being like a real thing, and there won't be any deception, whatever. And I said, okay, I have a very simple way, I think, to figure this out. He's like, what? I'm like, okay, well, if there's this contact moment that we all collectively get to participate in some way or whatever, let's just bring an exorcist, number one, and let's just ask them what they think about Jesus Christ. Let's just ask them what they think about it. It will answer everything. It will clarify everything, right? So it's the same with this. What do you say about Jesus Christ? Yeah. And if we Christians really believe that upon this question hinges life and death eternal, then why do we ignore that in all these like that's become more like ecumenical, in my opinion, many of these so-called dialogues, whatever. It's like, why do we ignore that in these discussions, if I may say so, to the peril of our Jewish friends?
Yeah. Right. It's akin to, it's wrong. It's morally wrong to encourage a person in like their gender dysphoria, right? To affirm somebody, a man who believes that they can become a woman, to affirm them in that. It's a cruel thing to do. It's not something you do to somebody you love, whose highest good you desire, even if it's hard for them to hear. You tell them the truth. You tell the truth to the people that you love, right? And I think the same is true in this case. We cannot, for the sake of ecumenicism or ecumeniacalism, it's a great term. I'm going to use that.
TM.
Try to paper over these things, right?
Yeah.
To the extent that ecumenical dialogue has a role, I think, for Catholics, it's to convert the people that we're having the ecumenical dialogue with. That's the reason to have the dialogue, right? And
the reason and argument. Hopefully, ultimately, it's God, and I know you know that, but it's ultimately God who converts, and through free assent. But to that's what we want. That's what we hope for.
And so we have to tell the truth, even about Israel, and even in the face of accusations of anti-Semitism or being, or like that we're Nazis, or whatever. If you believe this stuff, you just have to tell the truth, and this kind of I don't know if this brings it full circle to where we started this conversation talking about Protestants and evangelicals and our conversions, but it gets to when you tell the truth about Judaism to Jews, it's something that is going to challenge Protestants because they are implicated in it. And not just their views of Israel or their views of Zionism, but their their own closely held religious beliefs are implicated in that question that we would pose to our Jewish brothers and sisters. They have to answer the same question about who they think Christ is and what did he do.
Yes.
What was the cross, and what was the sacrifice on the cross, and what did that accomplish, and what is it that we are now? What is it that he asked us to do? And what does doing that do for us? There's no getting around those questions, and when you ask those questions and you get down to them, I think at that point, ecumenical dialogue kind of hits a brick wall, and I think that it's maybe does at a certain point more harm than good to paper over these differences, and it's better to just to be clear about what the differences are.
Very, very well said. I think what you were saying made me think. Another way I could describe my conversion is, again, some of this was happening beforehand, just as some of my questioning of aspects of the founding was actually initiated by some of the founders themselves, particularly John Adams, because a number of the founders were very negative about the American project at the end of their life. They, like Adams, thought this is a total distortion of what we already did. He was not optimistic. Jefferson wasn't optimistic. Madison wasn't optimistic. There's a book about this called Setting Sun. I forget the subtitle, but so it was already beginning before I became Catholic. But then when I became Catholic, and since then, it's now been crazy enough this summer, 7 years, it made me realize, wow, the entire modern world wants me to prescind from these questions. It wants me to just move along with life in every way without talking about these fundamental issues and acting as if we can just carry right along, keep buggering on, as Churchill said, without talking about these ultimate issues. Yeah. And I think a lot of us are realizing, particularly post-COVID, that is not possible. I know we got to wind it down. I had one other quick anecdote, and then if you wanted to share it, I'd be curious if you could share the anecdote you shared with me about, you don't have to say names, but if you don't want to, but some of the Protestant voices on this trip or maybe it was on this trip or elsewhere, that were actively in favor of reinstituting animal sacrifices. But on this anti-Semitism thing, so this was in 2014 or 15. I was in a lobby of a hotel in Jerusalem, and I was with one of my Orthodox Jewish friends. And I will say, I actually really love talking with my Orthodox Jewish friends more than many of my Christian friends. And I'll tell you why. They're just so much more blunt and direct, and I like that. Like, they're not as obsessed with being nice as we as Christians tend to be. And so I feel like I've just been able to have a more honest discussion with some of them. Not all of them, but some of them. And so he, I won't say their name, he called some conservative commentator, I forget who it was, honestly, at this point, but some conservative commentator in the U.S., an anti-Semite, because he had criticized something the state of Israel did. And this guy is a good guy. We agree on a lot of moral things, whatever. And I was shocked. This was 2015. I'm not even Catholic. This is 2 years before I had even started reading the Fathers. It's 4 years before I even converted. Like, wasn't on my horizon at all. And I was upset with him because I knew this person was not anti-Semitic. He didn't have a Jew-hating bone in his body. He was just criticizing something the state of Israel did. And so I literally pointed at my friend. I was like, you guys need to get over this. And he was kind of shocked. And I forget exactly how I phrased it, but I did point at him, and he took it. This is the kind of friendship we had and still have, I think. But I was like, I realize horrible things have happened to you guys, okay? And we don't want that to happen again. But you know what? That's not everybody. And that doesn't mean, I don't know about you, John, but if any of us who have had trauma in our lives in any way don't analyze that trauma in the light of reason, we tend to react this kind of a way. It's like we have a trauma response, not a rational response, right? And so I'm very sympathetic with a lot of Jews who have this because some bad things have happened. And I think there's a very systematic attempt to almost relive that as if anybody who says of even a smidgen of criticism is that same horrible Nazi thing that happened, which of course is false. But it leads to this sort of reaction. So I told him, I said, if this keeps happening, you guys are going to have a major problem on your hands. And I was fully Zionist, fully pro everything with Israel, basically. You guys are going to have a huge problem on your hand in the future if this keeps happening. And look where we are in 2026, 11 years later, 10 years later, whatever it is.
Yeah. I think there's a parallel here between you know, Americans' feelings about Israel, and you know, and the rise of identity politics on the right. You know, around
Yes.
2015, 2016, when Trump kind of first burst onto the scene, I remember having conversations about this with friends, and and some there was some talk about this in public too, that you know that the rise of identity politics on the left made it inevitable that identity politics was going to rise on the right. But
Yep.
one of the things that the left and sort of like the mainstream liberal establishment is not going to like is identity politics for white people. That
Yeah.
that you are not going to want that to come to pass, but you are making it inevitable by what you are doing with identity politics for every other racial and ethnic group.
Yeah.
And sure enough, 10 years later, I think it's fair to say that that is a part of the American political scene now, is identity politics for white people, and I don't think that that's going to help solve any of the problems that we have in our country.
No.
It was sort of baked in, you know. Once the left decided to go down that road, that it was just going to happen, right? That's just an observational thing.
Yeah.
And I think something similar is happening with Israel. That if you say that that nobody's allowed to criticize Israel, and you conflate the state of Israel with the Jewish people, by using these vague terms that are kind of have this kaleidoscopic, amorphous meaning, like Zionism, that can mean different things, and you can deploy them in arguments kind of in different ways when you want to kind of beat your interlocutor, then you are going to create a situation where people are going to turn against the state of Israel. They are not going to have a favorable
And Jews.
view. Right. Because you've conflated them, because
Yeah.
you've identified them as the same thing. And so
Yeah.
you're going to create animosity toward both the state of Israel and its political leadership, and its institutions and its political establishment, and the Jewish people. And I think that's part of what we're seeing now. As the boomer, there's a this gets into a lot of other things, but as the boomer generation, dies off and power is like wrenched from their hands. I think
geriatric hands, octogenarian, nonagenarian hands. Yes.
Yeah, sort of like, I'm picturing like Biden's hand,
Yeah.
the support for Israel among sort of evangelicals, mainstream evangelicals, Protestant, is really kind of a boomer thing. And as that fades, especially among younger generations of Americans, you are going to see completely different attitudes about Israel. And I'm sorry, it's not going to work to just chalk it all up to anti-Semitism. It's all Nick Fuentes' fault. That's not going to work. If and to your point, that our Jewish friends are not going to like what is going to come out of this if they continue to insist that criticism of Israel, or criticism of Netanyahu, or criticism of Israel's political establishment is anti-Semitic. That is a road they do not want to go down, because a lot of people like you and I are going to say, well, if that's how you're going to define anti-Semitism, then you're going to have to include me in that, because I don't think that unquestioning support for the state of Israel. If Mark Levin wants to call me an anti-Semite, then I'll accept the label, because his definition is crazy. It's crazy. And I'm sorry, but my loyalty, in terms of my political loyalty, is to the United States. I'm concerned about what is in our best interests, and I don't really care what Benjamin Netanyahu thinks is in our best interests. And I don't really care to go to war for the sake of Israel's national interests. And I don't really care to fund their foreign adventures or their military industrial complex. And so I think that
I'm kind of tired of funding our own military industrial complex,
right?
To be perfectly frank, yeah.
So I think I think that Jewish people who are willing to listen to this sort of thing that we're talking about here, and I think a lot of the smarter ones get it. And for what it's worth, I think Yoram Hazony gets it, and that's part of what he's doing.
He has said some remarkable statements. I don't agree with Yoram and everything, but he is certainly. But he has made some remarkable statements on this.
I think he understands it. If it's that nationalism demands that the political establishment of these democratic societies have to serve the national interest of their people, and if they don't, really bad things are going to happen. And so I think the whole landscape around this conversation between America and Israeli relations is changing on a generational level, on a geopolitical level, and I think the Jewish people who care about that and who are invested in it need to take that seriously. Need to take your criticism that you just elucidated seriously because it's a real concern.
Yeah, and it's not a threat from people like you or me. The idea isn't observation. If you don't do what I want, I'm going to turn against you. It's like, no, my position hasn't really changed. My faith worships an unjustly murdered Messiah. And it says, you must be willing to be unjustly murdered, if need be, for the sake of love, of God and of your neighbor. So if my Jewish neighbors were unjustly threatened, I want to be the kind of man, I want to be the kind of Catholic who would lay down my life for them, okay? But to go back to my friend Jason Jones, Jason does all sorts of amazing work. People need to look up the Vulnerable People Project, support him. I support him monthly on my really fat nonprofit salary. But I believe in what they're doing. But he does some great work in the Holy Land. And Jason was the one who told me, well, your Zionism will die. Jason has told me, now who knows what will happen. He's like, Josh, and he's very, very opposed to the stuff in Gaza. He's called it a genocide, etc. He gets called anti-Semite, whatever. He said, Josh, I think you and I could very well be martyred by this rising ethno movement among others, right? On the right or whatever. I think it's we may have to lay down our life at their hand to protect our Jewish neighbors at some point. So it's like if we're being faithful Catholics in this time and place, I don't really talk politics publicly too much, certainly not on this podcast. I mean, but especially post-COVID, we're in a time when I think it's impossible to divorce. I mean, this was always true, right? It was modern pretense that pretended it wasn't. It's impossible to separate politics and religion, particularly right now, because there are so many events where we have to be very, very clear about what our faith demands of us. Because if we are not, we will be swept away by these political movements, these ideologies, foreign and domestic, that will take us in the direction of Antichrist, both the Antichrist, if it happens to be in our lifetime, or one of his types that will precede him in his coming. I know you got to go soon. Do you have time to share that quick anecdote about the evangelical who you don't have to say their name?
Well, there's not much to share. But it happened on the visit to the red heifer operation, which was at the end of a very long day, and it was sort of like on the way to somewhere. So it was like it was yet another stop. And I didn't fully realize.
Really quick, just so people know, the red heifer is important because I forget which chapter in Numbers, but it's in the book of Numbers. For the tabernacle to be consecrated, you have to sacrifice a pure red heifer. So just so people know, this is where this comes from. It's from the Bible.
So in order to have a third temple, you need a red heifer. You need to sacrifice a red heifer to consecrate the tabernacle. So that's why for years now, there has been this operation to breed the perfect red heifer. And they got the, I think it started with these cows they got from Texas, from a Christian Zionist guy in Texas, and they have this breeding operation in Israel. I'm blanking on the location of this, but we went there, and there's a whole presentation that they do and a video, and at the end of the video, like this curtain opens up, and you're looking at the red heifers that like they're like barn, and there they are, and I just was, I was kind of like, gobsmacked. Like I was just sitting there with my jaw open. I'm like, this is amazing to me that this is such a going concern. And this is sort of like right when I was kind of realizing like all the religious Jews that I've interacted with here are totally on board with this. This is something that they are very much invested in. And then as we left here and we're walking back to the buses, the conversations among some of my Protestant colleagues on this trip were very surprising to me in expressing, a level of comfort with the idea that these red heifers would be sacrificed to consecrate a third temple, and the discussion was, ended up, talking about how St. Paul in the book of Acts visited the temple. And so since Paul visited the temple after the Christ's resurrection, then animal sacrifice is okay, even, within the context of Christianity. And I really made me realize that maybe for the past couple of years I've been maybe in a Catholic bubble somewhat, as can happen with converts, because I realize there's so much about the Catholic faith to learn that I didn't realize that this is where these ideas are not fringe among Protestants, among certain
Sure.
sects of Protestants. But it was shocking to me to hear these ideas bandied about. So shocking that I didn't even jump into the conversation. I just sort of listened, and it made me realize too, as a convert to Catholicism from Evangelicism, how far the distance is. That something like animal sacrifice is totally inconceivable to me, based upon my understanding of my Catholic faith. Totally would be an abomination. Would be completely, as I said before, a kind of neo-pagan act to do some kind of an animal sacrifice to God, to consecrate a Jewish temple. And the fact that I was on this trip with various sects of Protestants who were comfortable with this, and then who were citing Scripture as a justification for it, frankly blew my mind, and made me realize that. And by the way, these are the same folks that whenever I would mention dispensationalism, they would be fervently deny that they had any kind of dispensational beliefs. As when in fact they very clearly did, even if they wouldn't call it that. They
Sure.
or ascribe to this Schofield kind of interpretation of Scripture. But it just made me realize, the great distance that does exist between the Catholic vision of truth and of Christianity and what the Protestant vision is for some Protestants, and then what the religious Jewish vision is as well. And so it was very sobering in that sense, and it was sobering to see these operations and to see the efforts behind them. And for me, it sort of, shored up my resolve as a Catholic to be willing to kind of just speak clearly about these things, and speak clearly about what the Catholic faith says, and what Catholics can countenance and what we can't.
And you've done that brilliantly in this interview. Thank you for your very, very generous time. People need to check out your writings at the Federalist. This has been fantastic. This has been one of my favorite interviews I've ever done on this podcast. We're hopefully a young podcast, but just fantastic, John. Thank you so very much. And I think what we've been talking about, particularly the second half or so of the podcast, it really shows, like I said, I'm not a political commentator. That's not what Eternal Christian is primarily about. But when you are marinated in the sources of our tradition, Scripture, the fathers, the saints, the councils, which I am very, very blessed to do, thanks to our patrons and the work we're doing and the projects we're working on, the writings we're putting out, the podcast, all of it. It is impossible to see events like this and be theologically neutral. It is impossible. Okay. So this is not, oh, Josh, get out of that politics. It's no, I'm sorry. Yeah. This has been brought to my doorstep, and God's been having me in his house, and behind me is the church and all of the sources of that tradition. And they are very clear about these sorts of things. So it's
Yeah.
We're in that very interesting time right now where I just it's like a lot of like New Age Gnostic types will talk about we're in a simulation. It's like there's this other world going on. It's like, but there's a true sense. There's an authentic sense in which I think that's true. It's like once you realize these blinders that many of us grew up with, and we didn't even realize it about the modern world. Once those blinders come off, it's like, yeah, there's this like seeming intermixture between what you thought were non-overlapping worlds for a long time, in many ways non-overlapping, but you're like, not only do they overlap, and I knew they overlapped a little bit before I was Catholic, but they are like coterminous. You cannot investigate these things separated from one another. So anyway.
It's all true. It's all true.
It's all true. Well, we'll close with our normal anthem verse. Thank you again. But our normal anthem verse is Psalm 73, verses 25 through 26. Who have I in heaven but you? And on earth I desire nothing besides you. My flesh and my heart may fail, but the Lord is the strength of my heart and my portion forever.